Hey guys, tonight we slip softly into a dimly lit gallery where velvet curtains hush the echoes and the air smells faintly of old varnish and candle smoke. You're standing there, alone with the portraits, men and women gazing back at you from centuries ago, their expressions frozen somewhere between pride and pain. It takes a second before you notice something odd. The smiles are tight, the chin's heavy, the eyes strangely similar. Too similar. You're about to learn that behind these royal faces hides a secret so twisted by ambition and vanity that it quite literally reshaped generations of rulers and their jaws. You probably wouldn't survive a week in this world of silks and scandals, where love was a political tool and family meant everyone at court looked uncomfortably related. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step closer to one of the portraits, a woman in an elaborate lace collar, her face pale as porcelain. She was a queen once, though her eyes suggest a quiet suffering no crown could disguise. The label reads Maria Anna of Austria, and beside her hangs another painting, her husband, who also happens to be her uncle. You blink. Wait, what? Yes, welcome to the Habsburg family, where the royal bloodline was treated like a fine wine, meant to be kept pure, but instead turning sour over time. In this dim corridor of history, you can almost hear the low murmur of courtiers whispering about alliances. Across Europe, power was traded through marriages like stocks, and the Habsburgs were Wall Street's boldest players. Marry well, rule forever, they believed. But you'll soon see that well meant within. The Habsburgs didn't just rule countries. They collected them like stamps. Spain, Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, the Netherlands, even bits of Italy and the Americas bowed to their double-headed eagle crest. Their motto, whispered through generations, was simple: let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. And marry they did. To each other, you wandered deeper into the gallery. A grand portrait of Emperor Maximilian IV looms overhead, his expression proud and calculating. He's the architect of this genetic empire, the man who believed that if you couldn't conquer a land by sword, you could secure it by wedding vows. His descendants followed that advice a bit too literally. By the 1500s, the Habsburg family tree had begun to resemble more of a wreath, looping endlessly inwards. Historians still argue whether Maximilian foresaw the consequences. Some claim he was a visionary politician. Others say he set a curse in motion, one that centuries later would manifest in the famously protruding Habsburg Jaw, that unmistakable chin that seemed to grow larger with every generation. You know how people say you have your father's eyes? In this family, they'd whisper, you have your great-uncle's jaw and his anemia. Your imagination drifts to a royal banquet, the clinking of goblets echoing under chandeliers. Around the table sit kings, queens, and archduchesses, all technically cousins. The conversation is polite, the smiles rehearsed. No one mentions the elephant in the room, that they're running out of new people to marry. Somewhere, a court physician stares nervously into his goblet, knowing that the royal nursery is slowly turning into a genetic experiment. Outside the banquet hall, the empire expands and creaks. Spain's galleons sail home from the New World heavy with silver, but the future heir, Charles II, isn't strong enough to walk without help. Austria flaunts its palaces, but half the imperial family suffers from infertility or mental instability. The glittering crowns hide fragile bones, and yet as you walk past another row of portraits, you can't help but marvel at how beautiful they all tried to appear. Thick lace, heavy pearls, golden embroidery, as though wealth could outshine weakness. Painters worked hard to smooth the roughness, lifting chins and narrowing jaws, creating illusions of divine perfection. If you stare long enough, though, the paint seems to flicker, and you realize these faces are masks, carefully brushed over centuries of secrets. You pause before one particularly haunting image, a teenage girl with pale, delicate skin and enormous eyes that seem to follow you. Her name, the plaque says, is Margaret Theresa of Spain. She was married at 15 to her maternal uncle naturally, and died at just 21 after giving birth to her fourth child. The line between duty and destruction was always thin in royal Europe. As you linger there, the air feels heavier. like the ghosts of those long-gone monarchs are drawing close, curious about what you'll think of them. They probably wouldn't understand why their choices sound horrifying to us. To them, it was divine order, not deformity. God had chosen them to rule, and if that meant keeping the blood pure, then so be it. The problem, of course, was that nature doesn't care about divine order, and that's how the story you're about to drift through unfolds. A slow, tragic spiral of wealth, power, and obsession that ultimately collapsed under its own golden weight. Tonight, you'll walk alongside queens who looked in mirrors and saw their brothers' faces staring back, doctors who prayed their cures could outwit chromosomes, and kings whose minds broke before their thrones did. So breathe softly, let the candlelight flicker on those painted smiles, and remember, every crown has its price. The Habsburgs just paid theirs in flesh and bone. You drift farther down the candlelit corridor, where the air seems to hum with centuries of whispered vows. Every footstep echoes against marble floors polished by servants who've long since turned to dust. You're entering the world of a family so obsessed with control that they built an empire not just on land and loyalty, but on marriage contracts. The Habsburgs didn't just marry for love. Love, in their world, was a luxury. They married for borders, for treaties, for thrones, and most of all, for themselves. You imagine standing beside Emperor Charles V in the early 1500s, watching him unfurl maps across a table the size of a ship's deck. His gloved hand slides from Spain to Austria, down to the Low Countries, across the Alps, and over the Atlantic to the New World. All mine, he probably murmurs. Well, his and his relatives. Because at this point, almost every ruler he could name was a cousin. The Habsburgs had mastered what modern historians call dynastic politics. It's the kind of strategy that made wars unnecessary because weddings were cheaper and much easier to win. A daughter here, a nephew there, each marriage stitched together another corner of the map. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria marry, they'd repeat like a lullaby. It sounds peaceful until you realize that generations of cousins marrying cousins is less a lullaby and more a genetic time bomb with lace cuffs. Imagine the invitations. His Imperial Majesty Charles invites you to celebrate the marriage of his niece to his son, who is also her cousin once removed. You can almost see the confusion on the royal calligrapher's face, quill pausing mid-scroll. But in Vienna and Madrid, no one questioned it. It was divine design. Keeping the blue blood untainted was seen as holy work, though ironically it made that blood dangerously thin. Historians still argue whether this obsession came from superstition or strategy. Some say the Habsburgs genuinely believed that God favored their family line and would bless any child born from within it. Others claim it was simple paranoia, fear that outsiders might corrupt the family's delicate political balance. Either way, it worked for a while. Their empire stretched farther than the sun's shadow. But the seeds of collapse had already been planted in the wombs of their brides. Picture a wedding in the Spanish court, gold draperies, the scent of frankincense, choirs singing Latin hymns. The bride is 17, her groom 25. Their faces are pale and smooth, but their genealogies look like a snake swallowing its own tail. The ceremony ends, the applause dies down, and behind closed doors, the royal doctors quietly pray that this union will at least produce one healthy heir. They know the odds are getting worse. The family records tell the same story. By the 1600s, 9 out of 10 marriages among high Habsburgs were between close relatives, first cousins, uncles, nieces. Their family tree was less of a branching oak and more of a crown of thorns twisted in on itself. Geneticists today estimate that King Charles II of Spain, the final Habsburg ruler there, was more inbred than if his parents had been siblings. And yet at the time, no one dared to suggest stopping. The power was too sweet, the tradition too sacred. You can almost feel the weight of that arrogance pressing down on the air. The palace corridors must have echoed with pride, but also with coughs, limps, and quiet despair. Servants whispered of infants born too weak to cry, of queens pale as parchment. The courtiers knew but said nothing. After all, who would risk their neck to tell an emperor his family tree needed new branches? And somewhere in this silent courtly chaos, an idea took root. That deformity was destiny, a mark of royal uniqueness rather than decay. You might find that absurd, but remember, Centuries later, people still defend their family's superior genes at dinner tables. The Habsburgs just had crowns to justify it. One odd detail sticks with you. Among their many portraits, artists often exaggerated the family's signature features: the long chin, the heavy lower lip, the narrow temples. At first, it was flattery. Over time, it became truth by repetition. If every royal painting emphasized that jawline, it started to look noble. Power has a funny way of turning flaws into symbols. Still, even in that age of grandeur, there were whispers of concern. A few bold physicians began noticing patterns: miscarriages, weak children, unexplained melancholy. They wrote reports couched in vague Latin, careful not to blame the royal bedchambers. Some were quietly dismissed, others imprisoned, their warnings swallowed by velvet secrecy. The empire's stability mattered more than science, but time has no mercy for denial. The same marriages that united kingdoms were quietly unraveling the dynasty from the inside. By the late 1500s, the Spanish Habsburgs in particular were showing signs of something terrible, not just physical deformity, but fragility of mind. Kings who couldn't rule, queens who couldn't bear heirs, and an entire court pretending that everything was perfectly fine. If you listen closely, you might still hear the faint rattle of carriages arriving for another royal wedding, the guests murmuring about the bride's pale skin or the groom's sunken eyes. No one dared speak the truth aloud, that this family's thirst for control was costing them their very humanity. You exhale softly, the sound of your breath almost lost in the imagined hush of a Habsburg cathedral. Candles flicker, choirs sing, the incense swirls. And behind all the gold you sense it, the ghostly beginnings of a dynasty quietly poisoning itself with love, ambition, and too much of its own reflection. You find yourself staring at a vast tapestry stretched across the wall, a sprawling network of faces connected by golden threads, curling like vines over a faded map of Europe. At first glance, it looks majestic: emperors in armor, queens in jewels, princes with scepters. But the longer you look, the more tangled it seems. You trace one thread, following it from Spain to Austria, from Hungary to the Netherlands, only to realize it loops back to where it began. A closed circle, the genealogical spiderweb of the Habsburgs. It's here you start to feel the claustrophobia of royal lineage. Every marriage recorded in this web is another strand drawn tighter, another genetic lock clicked into place. Family first takes on a new meaning when everyone is family. You can almost hear a weary archivist sighing centuries later as he inks another name onto parchment, muttering, "Didn't we already have this match 3 times?" Historians still argue whether the Habsburgs truly understood what they were doing to themselves. Some say they saw it as destiny, God's chosen bloodline preserving divine order. Others insist it was ignorance mixed with arrogance, a refusal to believe that biology applied to royalty. After all, when your power comes from the heavens, you don't question whether your chromosomes are getting along, but nature keeps its own ledger. Every cousin's kiss, every uncle's vow was recorded there, in the quiet mathematics of genes. By the 1500s, the Habsburgs' genetic diversity had already narrowed alarmingly. In modern terms, scientists estimate their coefficient of inbreeding, yes, that's a real thing, reached levels today seen only in small, isolated villages. It's a statistic that would make any biologist wince, but back then it made priests nod approvingly. Imagine walking through one of their royal gardens. The hedges are sculpted into perfect shapes, each one trimmed to mirror the next. No wild vines, no surprises. That's how they liked their bloodline. Neat, predictable, controlled. But the thing about gardens like that is that they eventually stop growing. Beneath all the symmetry, the roots choke each other. You pause by the image of Emperor Charles V again. The man who ruled so many lands, they said the sun never set on his empire. His parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, all Habsburgs. His jaw already carried that telltale slope. Yet, from his perspective, his family's tangled web was a masterpiece. To him, every cousin marriage was another knot in the tapestry of dominance. You start to picture the family reunions, if they ever had such things. Every guest already related, every conversation a genealogical puzzle. You're my aunt's daughter's husband's niece, right? The confusion would have been enough to make even the palace clerks dizzy. There's a story, maybe apocryphal, maybe true, that a Spanish ambassador once joked, if the Habsburgs keep this up, They'll soon need only one table at every coronation. Still, the web kept growing inward. You follow the threads to one especially critical union. Philip II of Spain marrying his niece Anna of Austria. It wasn't scandalous. It was policy. Their son, Philip III, inherited not just a crown but a chromosome cocktail that left him frail and melancholic. Yet when his turn came, he too married a cousin. You can feel the pattern harden, like an echo that refuses to fade. There's a chilling kind of beauty in it, isn't there? This idea of power eating itself, wrapped in silk and ceremony. Each generation watched the last decline and said, "Ah, but this next one will be different." Spoiler, it wasn't. By the time we reached the 17th century, the spiderweb had tightened so much that escape was impossible. You picture the courtiers whispering behind fans, counting on their fingers to trace family links. Her father was his uncle's cousin, yes? Or was it his mother's brother's son? They'd eventually give up, shrug, and call it divine mystery. Easier that way. Less paperwork. One quirky tidbit: Habsburg genealogists actually bragged about how intertwined the line was. They published charts, ornate, gold-framed, impossible to follow, as proof of purity. It was like showing off a perfectly looped family logo. Today, those same charts hang in museums as cautionary tales about what happens when pride outruns logic. Yet the Habsburgs weren't the only ones weaving this web. Across Europe, the Bourbons of France and the Stuarts of England occasionally dipped into similar pools, but none so obsessively. The Habsburgs turned it into an art form. Marrying within wasn't just tradition. It was identity. You could say their motto should have been, "We are the family business." As you stand before that glittering tapestry, you realize it's not just a record of names. It's a record of consequences. Every golden thread that connects one cousin to another also carries the weight of lost potential. The what-ifs of love that might have been. The alliances that could have been healthier. The heirs who might have been stronger. The web glows softly under the flicker of imagined candlelight, and you understand. This isn't just history. It's a portrait of human stubbornness. You take one last look at the spiderweb before turning away, the golden lines blurring into darkness. Behind you, it almost seems to tremble, as though still alive, a living reminder that even the grandest empires can trap themselves in their own perfection. You wander out of the tapestry room and into a long marble corridor lined with portraits of wedding scenes, solemn, glittering, and just a little eerie. The air feels thick with perfume and candle smoke, and your footsteps echo faintly under a vaulted ceiling painted with cherubs who look slightly judgmental, as if they, too, are tired of attending another royal marriage between relatives. This is the world where passion bowed to politics, where "I love you" was less important than "your dowry includes Milan." You're entering an era where the Habsburgs perfected the art of marrying not for hearts, but for borders. You pass a massive oil painting, the wedding of Philip II of Spain to Mary Tudor of England in 1554. Their faces are pale and impassive, hands just barely touching. Behind them stand dozens of courtiers, each measuring the alliance like investors watching a stock merge. Love? That's not part of the contract. This marriage was a chess move and everyone knew it. When Mary died childless, Philip simply found another match. His niece, Anna of Austria. Efficient, if not romantic. You imagine how those royal halls must have felt before such ceremonies. The nervous shuffling of silks, the tight smiles, the air heavy with incense and calculation. Somewhere, a court musician tunes his lute, unaware that his gentle melody will score yet another union between two cousins. You almost want to whisper to him, "Play something hopeful just once." The Habsburgs didn't invent arranged marriage, but they industrialized it. For them, each union was a treaty wrapped in lace, a map redrawn with every ring slipped on a trembling hand. If two empires could be joined by blood, why risk war? The logic was elegant, but the consequences were messy. Historians still argue whether the family ever truly understood how fragile their legacy was becoming. Some believe they thought divine blessing would protect them, that God, who supposedly favored the Habsburgs, wouldn't let them fall victim to something as mundane as biology. Others say they knew but didn't care. The risk of disorder frightened them more than deformity. It's easier to ignore nature when your faith tells you you're chosen. You picture one of those brides, maybe Archduchess Maria Anna, maybe Margaret Theresa, sitting quietly in her dressing chamber, She's 16, wearing a gown that weighs more than she does, hands folded in her lap. Outside, her uncle, who's also her future husband, waits with a forced smile. She knows the world expects her to bear heirs, not happiness. The mirror in front of her reflects not a young girl, but generations of expectation stacked upon her shoulders. If you listen carefully, you might almost hear her thoughts blending with the sound of lace being fastened. Will my child look like me? Or like my father's brother's face that I see every day at court? There's something tragically human in that silence. Behind all the golden ceremony, there were people, nervous, hopeful, doomed. The chroniclers wrote of royal processions, of jewels and trumpets, but rarely of the quiet nights after the feasts, when the new bride cried softly into her embroidered pillow, wondering whether God really smiled upon such unions. And yet, amid all this melancholy, you can't help but admire the scale of it. The Habsburgs were architects of empire, weaving love into geopolitics with terrifying efficiency. They brokered peace between nations through bloodlines alone. No bullets, no battles, just brides. There's a certain cold genius in that, even if the price would one day be a child who couldn't speak or stand. You pass another painting, this one more intimate. A couple stands in a candlelit chapel exchanging rings. Their faces are young, even tender. For a moment, you allow yourself to imagine they might actually love each other. But then you read the small gold plaque. Ferdinand II and Maria Anna of Bavaria, first cousins. The tenderness fades into irony. You can almost hear the narrator in your head sigh. Of course they were. One quirky detail often overlooked. Habsburg weddings were sometimes so repetitive that they reused decorations and even the same musicians from earlier family ceremonies. A cousin's wedding might have the same playlist, the same food, the same priest, just a different pair of relatives at the altar. Recycling, 16th century style. At one wedding, guests reportedly joked that the family's coat of arms should just be replaced by a family tree drawn in a circle. No beginning, no end. Someone even suggested the motto, "Always ourselves." Not official, but hauntingly accurate. Yet despite all the whispered mockery, these marriages worked, for a while. Territories grew, crowns multiplied, and Europe bowed to the House of Habsburg. But with each alliance, the gene pool shrank. It's like watching a painter add layer after layer of gold leaf until the surface cracks beneath its own weight. The brilliance blinds you until it breaks. You leave the portrait hall, the music fading behind you. Somewhere in your imagination, the newlyweds step into a grand carriage, waving to crowds who cheer a future that will never truly arrive. The horses pull away, their hooves echoing on cobblestones slick with rose petals. A dynasty glides forward into its next mistake, and as you walk beside it, through centuries of lace, candlelight, and cold ambition, you start to realize that this was never a love story. It was a survival strategy that forgot what it meant to be human. You turn a corner and nearly bump into a statue, marble white, expression stern, chin unmistakably thrust forward. The famous Habsburg Jaw. Even in stone, it commands attention, as though daring you to look away. You step closer, tracing the jawline with your eyes, the sharp angle that seems too heavy for the delicate face it sits upon. It's strange how something so small, a few millimeters of bone, could come to symbolize an entire empire's undoing. Every family has a trait that runs through generations. Maybe freckles, maybe green eyes. The Habsburgs had a chin so pronounced it looked almost sculpted by stubbornness itself. Historians and geneticists call it mandibular prognathism, but in simpler terms, it's what happens when generations of intermarriage double down on the same recessive genes. For the Habsburgs, it became their unofficial logo, the mark of power, pride, and peril. You walk through a gallery of portraits where every monarch seems to share that same family resemblance. Long face, drooping lower lip, narrow eyes. The effect is uncanny, like a dynasty of mirrors. You almost expect the next painting to blink back at you. The origin of that jaw is hard to pin down. Some trace it back to Maximilian I, others to his mother, Mary of Burgundy. But with every generation, it deepened, exaggerated by painters who didn't dare make their subjects look too human. The result? Centuries of rulers who looked perpetually pouty, even when they weren't trying. You imagine being a court painter in that era, nervously dabbing at your canvas while an emperor sits rigidly before you. "A little more noble," he says, tilting his chin upward. You add a shadow, smooth a line, But there's only so much you can hide when genetics has already written the truth. Some artists, brave or foolish, painted what they saw. The heavy jaw, the slack mouth, the tired eyes. Those portraits, unsurprisingly, were often hidden away. Historians still argue whether the Habsburgs themselves saw the jaw as a curse or a badge of honor. Some letters hint at pride. Our chin, the mark of our blood. Others read more like quiet despair, especially from the women, who knew what it signaled about their children's future. In modern documentaries, scientists have reconstructed their skulls from preserved remains, confirming that the physical distortion was indeed genetic, not exaggeration. It wasn't just a visual quirk. It affected speech, chewing, and even breathing. Imagine trying to give royal speeches while struggling to close your mouth properly. Power but with pain, and yet there's something almost poetic about it. The same jaw that symbolized domination also whispered fragility. It told the world, we are untouchable, even as it proved the opposite. You pause at a painting of Charles II of Spain, the dynasty's tragic endpoint. His face bears the jaw in its fullest form, but his eyes seem lost. They carry the weight of centuries of choices made by people who never knew him. You can almost hear the tiredness in his bones. A fringe theory once claimed that the Habsburg Jaw was considered beautiful at court, a physical sign of divine heritage. And for a while it was. The sculpted chin became a visual shorthand for royal authority, as if the more exaggerated it became, the purer the bloodline must be. It's strange how people can convince themselves that sickness looks like strength. You can imagine the young princesses, studying their reflections in polished mirrors. They tilt their faces slightly, practicing how to smile without showing too much of the family trait. Behind closed doors, whispers float. She has her father's jaw. The words carry both pride and dread. There's an almost clinical curiosity to it now. Modern scientists have built digital family trees mapping 200 years of Habsburg inbreeding, calculating that in Charles II's case, nearly 1/4 of his genes were identical copies, as if he were the child of siblings, not generations of monarchs. The results read like a diagnosis centuries overdue, but numbers can't capture the human tragedy. The child who couldn't eat solid food, the empress who prayed her baby would look more like her and less like her uncle. One particularly chilling tidbit: royal doctors sometimes believed that strong family resemblance was a sign of divine favor. The Lord makes them in his image, one physician wrote, and in their own. You'd almost laugh if it weren't so tragic, the notion that deformity could be holiness. In your mind, you see the portraits flicker to life. The emperors and queens turn their heads ever so slightly, the candlelight catching those jutting chins. They don't look monstrous, just tired. Tired of expectation, tired of the illusion of perfection. Their jaws may have jutted out, but their power was already receding, generation by generation, like a tide that no one noticed until the shore lay bare. Historians still debate which moment marked the point of no return. Was it the birth of Philip IV, whose children rarely survived infancy? Or perhaps when Charles II came into the world, his health so fragile that priests doubted he'd live past his baptism? In truth, it wasn't one birth or one jawline. It was the entire structure, groaning under centuries of vanity disguised as destiny. As you walk away from the statue, you glance back once more. The Habsburg jaw, carved in marble, seems to smirk faintly in the candlelight. Maybe it knows the joke, that for all their wealth, all their empires, all their divine marriages, it was this small piece of bone that told their true story. A story of power, pride, and the quiet revenge of nature. You step into a smaller room, quieter, more intimate. Oil lamps flicker against walls crowded with portraits. Every face looks vaguely familiar. Tilted chins, pursed lips, those unmistakable almond eyes. It feels like you've been invited to a royal family reunion where no one dares mention the resemblance. These are the painter's masterpieces, or cover-ups, depending on how you look at it. Because here, in brushstrokes of gold and shadow, lies one of history's earliest forms of photo editing. Long before Instagram filters or airbrushed magazine covers, the Habsburgs had their court painters. Men like Diego Velázquez, Alonso Sánchez Coelho, and Titian, artists whose task was not just to immortalize, but to idealize. You can almost imagine the whispered orders. Soften the jaw, brighten the eyes, make her look less like her cousin. You stand before Velázquez's Las Meninas, the famous portrait of young Margaret Theresa, surrounded by maids and dwarfs in a grand play of mirrors and light. It's breathtaking, but you can't help noticing what isn't there. Her face, delicate and doll-like, hides the strain of her lineage. Velázquez's genius wasn't only in what he painted, but what he disguised. The Habsburg deformities were softened into elegance, the family's biological toll blurred under silk and shadow. Still, even the most skilled hand couldn't fully conceal centuries of genetic recycling. If you look closely, you can see the truth peeking through the varnish. The slightly sunken cheeks, the faint asymmetry, the hint of that heavy lower lip. You might even smile at the irony. A painter in the 1600s, unknowingly performing the same trick modern photographers do with digital retouching. Nothing new under the sun, just new tools for the same old vanity. Historians still argue whether painters like Velázquez were complicit or simply surviving. To refuse the royal commission would be unthinkable. To paint the truth might cost one's career, or worse. So they compromised. They told half-truths in oil and pigment. Art, one might whisper, is diplomacy in disguise. But not all artists bowed completely. A few dared to capture reality, like Juan Carreño de Miranda, whose portrait of Charles II doesn't flatter but exposes. The king's jaw juts forward, his lips slack, his gaze distant. It's almost painful to look at, yet hauntingly human. In that painting, you see the ghost of a dynasty confronting its reflection, finally unable to pretend. The court, of course, hated it. Rumor says the painting was quietly moved to a less prominent gallery. Too real, too close, but time has a way of rewarding truth. Centuries later, that same image became one of history's most studied portraits, a genetic confession disguised as royal art. You take a step back, letting your eyes wander across rows of gilded frames. The faces blur together into one composite expression, solemn, pale, inbred beauty. You imagine what it must have been like to live in that world, where a painter's brush decided how you would be remembered. A good day in the studio meant your jaw looked divine. A bad one meant generations would whisper about your family's decline. There's a funny modern parallel here. We like to think we've evolved, that our obsession with appearances is new, born of Hollywood and Photoshop. But you can almost hear a Habsburg duchess from 1620 sighing the same thing influencers say now. Please, make sure I don't look tired. In a way, the painters were the original PR team. Their portraits traveled across Europe, serving as royal Tinder profiles for political marriage proposals. A king in Vienna might receive a painting of a potential bride from Madrid, tilt his head thoughtfully and say, fine complexion. She'll do. The irony. The real bride often looked very little like her portrait. Sometimes she arrived in person, and the groom's first words were a startled silence. There's one story about Archduke Charles, who, upon meeting his long-promised bride, reportedly murmured, "The artist was too kind." You can almost feel the collective cringe of the courtiers standing nearby. The painters, though, kept working, brush after brush, portrait after portrait, until the image of the Habsburgs became both real and unreal. They weren't just recording faces, they were sculpting propaganda. Each canvas whispered the same message: we are eternal, we are divine. And yet the irony drips from every layer of paint, because what they were really recording was decline disguised as dignity. Still, beauty is a kind of mercy, isn't it? Even in these portraits, where tragedy hides under rouge, there's a strange tenderness. You sense the artist's empathy. Maybe they knew they were painting ghosts, young queens doomed by inheritance, kings whose bodies betrayed them before their empires did. Historians still debate whether these portraits were deliberate deception or subtle rebellion. Artists hinting at the truth through tiny flaws, a smudge left intentionally uncorrected. Maybe Velázquez, in his quiet genius, knew the dynasty would one day crumble, and so he left behind not perfection, but humanity. As the lamps flicker, you take one last look at the painted faces. The eyes seem to follow you as you leave, as though they're asking, "Do you see us now?" You do. You see the beauty, the burden, and the brushstrokes of denial. And as you step back into the dark corridor, you can't help but think, maybe the Habsburgs weren't just cursed by blood. Maybe they were cursed by how desperately they wanted to look perfect while falling apart. You push open a heavy wooden door and enter a colder chamber. The light fades here, replaced by the glimmer of metal goblets and embroidered banners drooping with age. A single portrait dominates the wall, King Charles II of Spain. His name has echoed like a sigh through every royal corridor you've passed tonight. And now, face to face with him, you finally understand why. You stand before the man who became the tragic symbol of everything the Habsburg bloodline had been building toward. A fragile culmination of power, pride, and too much shared DNA. Charles II, the last Spanish Habsburg, born in 1661, died in 1700 without an heir. His birth was meant to secure the future of an empire. Instead, it marked the beginning of its slow, wheezing end. The first thing you notice in his portrait is the jaw. That monumental Habsburg feature now exaggerated almost beyond recognition. His lips hang open slightly, his tongue too large for his mouth. His chin juts forward like an architectural accident. The painter has done his best to soften it, but the truth bleeds through the brushstrokes. His skin is pallid, his eyes watery, unfocused. You can almost feel the exhaustion in his posture. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. The nickname stuck because no one could believe a man so sickly, so strange, so burdened could be merely human. In an age that explained everything, through superstition, his deformities were seen as proof of dark magic. Ministers whispered of curses. Priests sprinkled holy water over the royal cradle. But no spell was needed. Nature had already cast one. Charles was the product of 16 generations of relentless inbreeding. Geneticists later calculated his inbreeding coefficient at an astonishing 0.25, as if he were the direct child of brother and sister. You picture the invisible dice of heredity being rolled again and again until they finally came up snake eyes. As a baby, Charles couldn't walk or speak properly. His mother, Mariana, of Austria, ruled in his stead for years because the boy could barely feed himself. He suffered from rickets, epilepsy, chronic infections. The list reads like a royal medical encyclopedia. His lower jaw grew so large he couldn't close his mouth, and food often had to be mashed into a near liquid for him to swallow. He was, by all accounts, gentle and devout, but his body betrayed him at every turn. Historians still argue about how much he understood of his condition. Some say he was mentally disabled. Others insist he was simply trapped in a body that couldn't keep up. Letters from ambassadors describe him as kind but vacant, a man whose every movement seemed to take enormous effort. One wrote, "He tries to smile, and the court weeps." Yet even in his frailty, Charles II was the center of Europe's attention. Every nation waited for news of an heir that would never come. His life became a public countdown. Courtiers kept lists of every illness, every fainting spell, like investors tracking a dying stock. And through it all, the palace tried to maintain appearances. The king would appear at processions, dressed in stiff brocade, jewels glinting under sunlight. From a distance, he looked regal. Up close, he was trembling. Doctors swarmed him. They prescribed mercury for his humors, leeches for his headaches, enemas for his melancholy. One physician suggested powdered unicorn horn. Another recommended bathing in bull's blood. It's easy to laugh now, but those were acts of desperation, attempts to cure the incurable, to fix in one man what centuries of marriage contracts had broken. The courtiers, of course, had their own theories. Some blamed his mother's overbearing control. Others whispered of witchcraft, a curse placed by France or the devil himself. The irony? The real curse was genetics, not sorcery. The same dynasty that had claimed to be chosen by God was undone by the natural laws they believed didn't apply to them. There's something haunting about imagining Charles II sitting alone in his grand chambers, surrounded by the relics of a decaying empire. The walls are lined with tapestries depicting his ancestors, warriors, conquerors, emperors, and here he is, their last echo, fragile and childless. He prays nightly for strength, for heirs, for deliverance. Outside, the empire is splitting apart like old wood under strain. One night, perhaps, you imagine him staring into a mirror. He sees the drooping lip, the receding chin, the haunted eyes, the genetic watermark of his ancestors staring back. Maybe he wonders, was this what they wanted? Was this what God chose? It's a quiet, lonely thought, the kind of question no one dares answer. A fringe rumor circulated after his death, that when his body was exhumed for examination, his corpse was said to be as black as ink and stank of sulfur. Priests declared it proof of witchcraft. Modern historians roll their eyes, of course, but it's telling how even in death, people refuse to accept science over superstition. For them, the tragedy of Charles II had to be mystical, not mathematical. He died at 38, without children, without hope, and without understanding how his life had been mapped out centuries before his birth. His autopsy revealed a heart the size of a peppercorn, one shriveled testicle, and a body riddled with fluid and decay. The doctor's report concluded dryly, his entire body, inside and out, was in a state of decomposition. That line, more than any curse, was the empire's obituary. When you step back from his portrait, you notice how the shadows around him seem to stretch, as if the walls themselves remember the weight of his life. The Habsburgs had tried to cheat mortality through marriage, and instead they found it written on their faces. Charles II was not just a king, he was a warning. And as you leave the room, the echo of your footsteps mingles with the faint rustle of silk from long ago, the sound of a dynasty unraveling, one chromosome at a time. You step through a tall arched doorway into a room that smells faintly of herbs, candle wax, and despair. This is the physician's chamber, where medicine met monarchy, and where the most brilliant minds of the Spanish court tried, and failed, to rescue a dying bloodline. The air feels heavy, like centuries of unanswered prayers have settled into the stones. You picture it now. The soft shuffle of velvet slippers on marble, the murmur of Latin between bearded doctors, the nervous clatter of glass vials. In the middle of the room lies a wooden table covered with scrolls and surgical instruments that gleam dully under candlelight. Every physician here has sworn loyalty not only to the king but to the illusion of control, the belief that human hands could undo what centuries of inbreeding had done. Charles II was their greatest challenge, their living experiment. His body was frail, his stomach perpetually upset, his limbs weak, his mind unpredictable. But to question why he was this way, to suggest that the royal marriages themselves were the cause, was to risk being branded a traitor. So they worked in silence, prescribing potions with hope and fear in equal measure. One might recommend aquavitae mixed with powdered coral. Another might prescribe baths in donkey's milk or amulets made of dried toad hearts. Yes, toad hearts. These were the scientific treatments of the 17th century, where superstition dressed itself as medicine. You can almost see the royal apothecary, his hands trembling as he grinds herbs, whispering a prayer that this time, maybe this mixture will work. Historians still argue how much these doctors truly believed in their cures. Some were charlatans, others sincere scholars trapped in a dark age of understanding. One Spanish physician wrote that the king's weakness stemmed from the corruption of blood and melancholy vapors. Another claimed the problem was not physical but spiritual, that Charles's soul had been burdened by the sins of his ancestors. He recommended confession and holy fasting. Imagine the scene: the king, pale and gasping, surrounded by men in black robes debating whether his pain is divine punishment or bad digestion. A few daring voices, perhaps those educated in the new sciences of anatomy emerging in Italy, might quietly suggest that something hereditary was at play. But they spoke softly because the church still watched, and blasphemy could ruin a career faster than a misdiagnosis. One curious detail: royal physicians of the Habsburg court were required to record the king's pulse, temperature, and even the color of his urine daily. The reports filled volumes and diaries of slow decay. Reading them now is like listening to a candle burn out, one flicker at a time. You might wonder, did they ever suspect the truth? Some did. A few brave medics years later whispered that the Habsburg marriages had become unnatural. But no one dared write it down officially. You didn't question God's chosen rulers, even when their very bodies screamed the question for you. And yet, amid all this futility, there were moments of genuine humanity. One physician, Dr. Juan de la Sierra, reportedly wept after an examination, saying, "This boy is innocent, yet he bears the punishment of kings." That line lingers in the air like incense, the one note of compassion in a room filled with fear. You can almost see the bottles glinting on the shelf, each labeled in fine script: elixir of vigor, drops of strength, essence of youth. None of them worked, of course, but hope is a stubborn thing. The doctors tried everything: bloodletting, fumigations, even a strange ritual involving ground emeralds dissolved in wine. The king's health would rally for a week, then collapse again, leaving everyone pretending that progress had been made. When Charles's condition worsened, priests joined the physicians, turning medicine into ceremony. Holy relics were pressed against his chest. Relics of saints were placed under his pillow. One account even claims that the bones of Saint Vincent were brought in for a night, as though holiness could seep through the blankets. The doctor stood by awkwardly, taking notes, pretending this was all part of the treatment plan. It's easy to judge them now, but you start to feel a strange sympathy for these men. They were trapped too, prisoners of a dynasty that refused to see its own reflection. Every failure risked their heads. Every success would be claimed by divine will. It was a lose-lose profession. Historians still debate whether any of these desperate cures prolonged the king's life or simply prolonged his suffering. Most agree it was the latter. By his final years, Charles's body had become a battlefield of misguided remedies: mercury in his veins, herbs in his stomach, prayers in the air. His skin turned sallow, his breath shallow. Even his servants whispered that he looked more ghost than man. And yet, through it all, the empire carried on the charade. The bells rang for mass, the courtiers bowed, the doctors took notes, and the candles burned low. The machinery of monarchy doesn't stop just because its king is dying. It simply pretends harder. You stand now in that quiet chamber, hearing the echoes of quills scratching on parchment, the murmur of hopeless men convincing themselves they can save the unsavable. On the table beside you sits a silver bowl filled with what looks like crushed pearls. A prescription, perhaps, for strength and beauty. You reach out, almost touching it, and for a moment, you feel the futility in their hands. Because the truth is, the Habsburgs didn't just create a medical mystery. They created a tragedy of faith. They believed they could bend nature, rewrite heredity, and outpray biology. But here, in this flickering room of glass and whispers, nature had the last word. The corridor you step into next is lined with gilded doors, each one marked by an inscription: Vienna, Madrid, Prague, Brussels. Behind them lies the secret machinery of royal matchmaking. The air smells faintly of perfume and parchment. You're in the diplomatic heart of the Habsburg Empire, where marriages were drafted like treaties and brides were bartered like commodities. You imagine the scene inside one of those rooms. A circle of courtiers hunched over a table strewn with maps, family charts and sealed letters from ambassadors. Candles drip wax onto documents that will decide the fate of nations and of young women who haven't even met their grooms. This is where the phrase, "the wedding of sickness and state," earns its meaning. No violins, no romance, just logistics. A clerk reads aloud, "The Archduchess Maria Anna of Austria, aged 14, may marry His Most Catholic Majesty Philip Thor, aged 44. The room nods in approval. Another clerk adds, "She is his niece." No one flinches. The ink flows. A dynasty tightens its loop once more. For the Habsburgs, love was not an option. It was an obstacle. Marriages weren't unions of hearts, but mergers of empires. Each new match was weighed by what it could gain: a new port, a new ally, a larger dowry. "Better a cousin than a rival," one Spanish noble quipped. And so it went, generation after generation, until the family tree began to resemble a coiled rope, strangling itself. Historians still argue whether any of these royal matches were happy. Letters between some couples suggest genuine affection, small gestures of tenderness buried under duty. Others read like cold ledgers of exchange. Her dowry was satisfactory. The princess obeys. You can almost hear the sigh of resignation in those ink-stained words. The wedding preparations were grand, of course. Silk imported from Florence, pearls from the Indies, choirs rehearsing hymns of divine blessing. But beneath the splendor was anxiety. Would the bride survive childbirth? Would the heir be healthy? Would the union strengthen the empire or expose another crack? These questions echoed louder than the wedding bells. Picture a marriage negotiation between two courts, say Vienna and Madrid. Messengers ride for weeks through snow and dust, carrying portraits painted with flattering lies. When they arrive, the paintings are unwrapped, studied, and judged. "A fine complexion," says one advisor, "though the jaw—" He stops. Everyone knows what he means, but no one dares speak it. The alliance must proceed. Sometimes the negotiations dragged on for years. By the time an agreement was reached, the intended bride might already be old enough to have grandchildren of her own. Or worse, dead. One proposal famously fell apart when the groom's cousin, also his prospective wife, died of smallpox during the discussions. The diplomats simply crossed her name out and substituted her younger sister. Problem solved. It's grotesque, yes, but also darkly fascinating. You begin to realize how mechanical the process had become. The Habsburgs saw themselves not as people, but as instruments of divine architecture. Each wedding was a brick in God's empire. And if the mortar cracked, well, there were always more cousins. In one of the side chambers, a priest blesses an engagement contract while muttering under his breath. Even he seems tired of pretending that this is holy. He's seen too many pale brides carried from their chambers months later, their bodies exhausted by the burden of dynasty. He knows the cycle won't stop. There's a chilling tidbit from one ambassador's diary. At the Spanish court, a clerk kept a ledger listing all the intermarriages among Habsburgs, with brief medical notes beside each name. Weak lungs, infertile, melancholic. It reads like both genealogy and autopsy. By the last entries, the notes grow shorter. Deceased without issue. You wander through another doorway into a dim ballroom, its ceiling painted with cherubs and banners declaring Deo et Sanguine, for God and blood. The phrase feels like a cruel joke now. You can almost see a wedding feast unfolding, goblets raised, musicians playing, the bride's trembling smile. Somewhere behind her, her mother watches with the same expression, knowing exactly how this story ends. Historians debate whether the architects of these marriages ever doubted their work. Some letters from Vienna suggest moments of unease, ministers noting, "The blood grows close." But political survival left no room for science. "A marriage is not a man," one advisor wrote. "It is a map." And yet, amid all the calculation, you can glimpse flickers of rebellion. One young princess, Maria Christina, secretly refused to marry her cousin and pleaded to join a convent instead. Her letter to her father is heartbreaking in its simplicity. "I would rather serve God freely than serve my husband as property." Her request was denied. She married her cousin within the year. You take a deep breath. The ballroom is empty now, but the ghosts of those celebrations still linger. Laughter echoing under the chandeliers, the faint scent of roses hiding the weight of tragedy. Each union was meant to ensure the dynasty's survival. Instead, it became the slow-motion collapse of one of the greatest empires Europe had ever known. As you turn to leave, your footsteps echo against marble. You can almost hear the scratching of pens behind those closed doors, drafting yet another contract, sealing yet another fate. The ink dries, the candles gutter. The bloodline tightens another knot in its golden noose. The corridor you step into next is lined with gilded doors, each one marked by an inscription: Vienna, Madrid, Prague, Brussels. Behind them lies the secret machinery of royal matchmaking. The air smells faintly of perfume and parchment. You're in the diplomatic heart of the Habsburg Empire, where marriages were drafted like treaties and brides were bartered like commodities. You imagine the scene inside one of those rooms. A circle of courtiers hunched over a table strewn with maps, family charts and sealed letters from ambassadors. Candles drip wax onto documents that will decide the fate of nations and of young women who haven't even met their grooms. This is where the phrase, "the wedding of sickness and state," earns its meaning. No violins, no romance, just logistics. A clerk reads aloud, "The Archduchess Maria Anna of Austria, aged 14, may marry His Most Catholic Majesty Philip IV, aged 44. The room nods in approval. Another clerk adds, "She is his niece." No one flinches. The ink flows. A dynasty tightens its loop once more. For the Habsburgs, love was not an option. It was an obstacle. Marriages weren't unions of hearts, but mergers of empires. Each new match was weighed by what it could gain: a new port, a new ally, a larger dowry. "Better a cousin than a rival," one Spanish noble quipped. And so it went, generation after generation, until the family tree began to resemble a coiled rope, strangling itself. Historians still argue whether any of these royal matches were happy. Letters between some couples suggest genuine affection. small gestures of tenderness buried under duty. Others read like cold ledgers of exchange. Her dowry was satisfactory. The princess obeys. You can almost hear the sigh of resignation in those ink-stained words. The wedding preparations were grand, of course. Silk imported from Florence, pearls from the Indies, choirs rehearsing hymns of divine blessing. But beneath the splendor was anxiety. Would the bride survive childbirth? Would the heir be healthy? Would the union strengthen the empire or expose another crack? These questions echoed louder than the wedding bells. Picture a marriage negotiation between two courts, say Vienna and Madrid. Messengers ride for weeks through snow and dust, carrying portraits painted with flattering lies. When they arrive, the paintings are unwrapped, studied, and judged. A fine complexion, says one advisor, though the jaw... He stops. Everyone knows what he means, but no one dares speak it. The alliance must proceed. Sometimes the negotiations dragged on for years. By the time an agreement was reached, the intended bride might already be old enough to have grandchildren of her own. Or worse, dead. One proposal famously fell apart when the groom's cousin, also his prospective wife, died of smallpox during the discussions. The diplomats simply crossed her name out and substituted her younger sister. Problem solved. It's grotesque, yes, but also darkly fascinating. You begin to realize how mechanical the process had become. The Habsburgs saw themselves not as people, but as instruments of divine architecture. Each wedding was a brick in God's empire. And if the mortar cracked, well, there were always more cousins. In one of the side chambers, a priest blesses an engagement contract while muttering under his breath. Even he seems tired of pretending that this is holy. He's seen too many pale brides carried from their chambers months later, their bodies exhausted by the burden of dynasty. He knows the cycle won't stop. There's a chilling tidbit from one ambassador's diary. At the Spanish court, a clerk kept a ledger listing all the intermarriages among Habsburgs, with brief medical notes beside each name. Weak lungs, infertile, melancholic. It reads like both genealogy and autopsy. By the last entries, the notes grow shorter. Deceased without issue. You wander through another doorway into a dim ballroom, its ceiling painted with cherubs and banners declaring Deo et Sanguine, for God and blood. The phrase feels like a cruel joke now. You can almost see a wedding feast unfolding, goblets raised, musicians playing, the bride's trembling smile. Somewhere behind her, her mother watches with the same expression, knowing exactly how this story ends. Historians debate whether the architects of these marriages ever doubted their work. Some letters from Vienna suggest moments of unease, ministers noting, the blood grows close. But political survival left no room for science. A marriage is not a man, one advisor wrote. It is a map. And yet, amid all the calculation, you can glimpse flickers of rebellion. One young princess, Maria Christina, secretly refused to marry her cousin and pleaded to join a convent instead. Her letter to her father is heartbreaking in its simplicity. I would rather serve God freely than serve my husband as property. Her request was denied. She married her cousin within the year. You take a deep breath. The ballroom is empty now, but the ghosts of those celebrations still linger. Laughter echoing under the chandeliers, the faint scent of roses hiding the weight of tragedy. Each union was meant to ensure the dynasty's survival. Instead, it became the slow-motion collapse of one of the greatest empires Europe had ever known. As you turn to leave, your footsteps echo against marble. You can almost hear the scratching of pens behind those closed doors, drafting yet another contract, sealing yet another fate. The ink dries, the candles gutter. The bloodline tightens another knot in its golden noose. You step into a quieter room, narrow, dim, the air thick with candle smoke and the faint sweetness of incense. A single window lets in a sliver of moonlight that cuts across the floor like a blade. Here, in this hush, the whispers of faith and fear merge into one question that haunted the Spanish court. Was it a curse or a consequence? It's easy to understand why they believed in curses. How else could one explain the decline of a dynasty that had once ruled continents? The Spanish Empire, vast and glittering under Charles V and Philip II, now trembled under the weight of a sickly monarch who could barely sign his name. To the priests and courtiers, it couldn't simply be biology. It had to be divine retribution. God must have withdrawn his favor. You can almost hear them debating it late into the night, robes rustling, voices echoing off stone. The sins of the fathers, one confessor whispers. Or the folly of marriage without blessing, replies another. A third mutters darkly about witchcraft, the work of France, or of the devil himself. Anything but science. Anything but the truth that no one dared name. That the Habsburgs had done this to themselves. The irony burns quietly beneath the incense. In their quest to keep their blood pure, they had made it poisonous. A family so determined to stay divine had become, in the end, only human, frail, flawed, and finite. Historians still argue about what the people of Spain believed. Some chroniclers describe peasants whispering about omens, dead birds falling from the sky, crops that refused to grow, the sound of phantom bells tolling for a living king. Others record priests preaching that Spain was being punished for its pride, for its gold-fueled greed, for the sins of empire. Maybe they were all right in their own way. Every empire writes its fall as a moral story. You picture the royal chapel during one of Charles II's desperate prayer ceremonies. The air is thick with candle smoke and chanting. The king kneels trembling before an altar covered in relics, bones of saints, splinters of the true cross, a vial said to hold the Virgin's tears. His mother stands behind him, clutching her rosary, her lips moving soundlessly. The choir sings, the incense swirls, and somewhere deep in the palace, a servant whispers that the king has vomited again. The line between faith and fear dissolves here. You can almost feel it pressing against your skin, centuries of belief that everything must have a divine cause. And yet amid all the prayers, the illness only grows. His body weakens, his mind falters, and the empire crumbles inch by inch, like wax melting from a candle's base. At some point, the Spanish court called in an exorcist, Father Froilan Diaz. He examined the king and declared that Charles had been cursed since birth. He even produced a list of the supposed sorcerers responsible. The evidence? Strange substances found under the king's bed, hair, fingernails, scraps of parchment with spells. The court gasped, the priests nodded, and the physicians exhaled in relief. At last, an explanation that didn't threaten their careers. But here's the darkly comic twist. When the Inquisition later examined Father Diaz, they concluded that he had been deceived by the devil. The whole affair collapsed under its own absurdity, yet no one laughed. The court simply moved on to the next superstition. One fringe historian suggested that this obsession with curses wasn't just denial, it was survival. To admit that royal blood could decay was to question the divine order of monarchy itself. Better to blame witches than to confront the terrifying thought that kings were subject to nature, just like peasants. You walk slowly toward the altar at the end of the room, its surface littered with melted wax and forgotten prayers. There's a bronze crucifix there, its face worn smooth by centuries of trembling fingers. You can almost hear the whispers layered in the air. Queens begging for fertility, priests for miracles, physicians for proof. None of them received what they wanted. The tragedy is how sincerely they all believed. The same people who built cathedrals and conquered oceans couldn't imagine a world where their own choices had consequences written in blood. They thought heredity was theology, that noble blood was sacred and self-renewing. And when nature contradicted them, they called it a curse. You pause and glance out the window. The moonlight touches the rooftops of Madrid, pale and quiet. Somewhere out there, a woman scrubs her laundry by the river, humming softly. She's never seen the king, but has heard the stories. That his tongue is too large, that his soul is haunted, that his sickness means the world is ending. For her, the curse is real because the empire feels cursed. Taxes rise, wars drag on, food grows scarce. The king's frailty becomes a mirror of the people's exhaustion, and perhaps that's the cruel poetry of it. The Habsburgs' bodies became metaphors for their empires. As their bones twisted, their territories fractured. As their blood thinned, their power drained. Biology and politics, inseparable, decaying in tandem. You take one last look around the room. The candles burn low, the air grows heavy, and the whisper you hear now doesn't sound like fear anymore. It sounds like understanding. Not every curse comes from witches. Some we cast ourselves with our own hands, our own choices, our own pride. The corridor narrows, winding upward into the quiet majesty of Vienna's Hofburg Palace, the other heart of the Habsburg world. While Spain's golden empire was unraveling, Austria's branch of the family was still thriving, still marrying, still spinning its intricate web of alliances. You can almost hear the rustle of silk gowns and the scratch of quills on parchment, as if the walls themselves remember every match negotiated here. This is where the Vienna matchmakers worked their peculiar magic. Behind heavy oak doors, royal advisors, bishops, and imperial mothers planned unions that stretched across Europe like threads of a spider's web, neat, strategic, and occasionally lethal. If Madrid was desperation, Vienna was confidence. Here, marriage was not just policy. It was an art form. You picture the scene. A grand study filled with smoke from Turkish tobacco. The emperor's secretary bent over maps while courtiers sip sweet wine. They are not discussing love stories, but borders. If we marry Archduchess Maria Anna to the Duke of Tuscany, one begins, we secure Italy. Another counters. But if we wed her to Bavaria, we block France. Every sentence is about chess pieces disguised as people. And when the plans are finalized, the royal children are informed, gently, like one might announce the weather. Historians still argue whether the Austrian Habsburgs were cruel or merely pragmatic. Some paint them as cold architects of empire. Others suggest they truly believed their family's survival depended on these calculated unions. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. They were trapped by their own brilliance, aware of Spain's downfall, yet convinced they could avoid it through smarter marriages. But smarter still meant closer. The advisors were clever in politics, but stubborn in genetics. They feared outsiders, French, English, even other German princes. Better the devil we know, one count famously muttered, meaning, of course, another cousin. So while the Austrian branch avoided the catastrophic collapse of Charles II's line, they kept the same dangerous pattern, tightening the family circle until love had nowhere left to breathe. You walk into a candlelit salon filled with portraits of Habsburg brides. Each face tells a story written in lace and obligation. Some were sent to Spain, others to Hungary or Naples. Most were married before 20, many to men twice their age. The letters they left behind when they could write them read like diary entries of captivity. My husband is kind but silent. I pray each night my children live. I am lonely, but this is God's will, and yet not all were miserable. Some queens found ways to turn duty into power. Maria Anna of Austria, for instance, used her intelligence and diplomacy to influence policy behind the scenes. She wrote to her brother, Emperor Ferdinand II, advising him on war strategies and religious negotiations. Even trapped in gilded cages, some Habsburg women learned to rule through whispers and charm. Still, the system itself never changed. Vienna's marriage machine kept spinning, even as Spain collapsed and the Holy Roman Empire grew weary. The matchmakers refused to learn the lesson of Charles II. They saw his tragedy not as a warning, but as an anomaly, a sad accident of fate rather than the product of their own arrogance. You pause before a large painting depicting a marriage negotiation. The room in the painting mirrors the one you're standing in. High ceilings, curtains drawn against the cold, a table spread with maps and wine. At one end, a priest holds a small crucifix. At the other, an advisor holds a list of dowries. Between them sits a frightened young girl, her name inked in the corner, Eleonora of Austria. She's only 15. The contract will send her to Italy within the month. You can almost hear the conversation that followed after the painter left. Her mother saying softly, "You will be a good wife, my child. You will bring honor to us all." The girl nods. What else can she do? The doors close, and her name becomes another thread in the great Viennese web. One quirky detail preserved in the archives. The Austrian court astrologer was required to approve every royal wedding date based on the stars. He calculated auspicious alignments to ensure fertility and peace, even as the genealogists quietly ignored the fact that both bride and groom shared the same grandparents. Science and superstition, dancing together in candlelight. Historians still debate whether any of these astrologers or advisors ever voiced private doubts. Some diaries hint at unease. One counselor wrote, "We play with destiny as though it were a board game." But as long as the empire held together, no one dared stop. Every successful match seemed to justify the system. Every alliance that yielded land or peace was another argument for keeping the bloodline pure. You move deeper into the palace, past a wall hung with embroidered family crests. The air feels heavier here, the silence deeper. The Habsburgs ruled not just through armies, but through marriages carefully planned like military campaigns. And though they believed themselves above ordinary mortals, their fates were as fragile as the parchment contracts they signed. Somewhere in these halls, an advisor probably once whispered, "Spain failed because they were careless. We shall not repeat their error." He was wrong, of course. They repeated it with precision. You reach the end of the corridor, where a tall mirror stands framed in gold. In its reflection, the portraits seem to stare back at you. Hundreds of faces, all related, all carrying echoes of the same eyes, the same jaw, the same story. It's beautiful and tragic, and you can't quite tell where ambition ends and madness begins. For now, Vienna still shines. The chandeliers blaze, the waltzes play, and the empire still believes in its own perfection. But in the mirror's reflection, you already sense the cracks forming, faint, invisible, inevitable. The next door creaks open to a quieter chamber, smaller, lined with tapestries that muffle every sound. A soft glow from a single candelabrum paints the walls in honey-colored light. You feel as though you've stepped inside someone's secret, a place not meant for court gossip or politics, but for reflection. And in the center of this stillness stands a gilded mirror, tall enough to swallow a person whole. You're not alone. A woman stands before it, her corseted silhouette delicate but tense. You recognize her from portraits. Maria Anna of Austria, sister of Emperor Ferdinand II, aunt and later wife to Philip IV of Spain. Her reflection trembles slightly in the candlelight. For a moment, you almost feel like you shouldn't be watching. She lifts a hand to her face, pale, elegant, and studies herself the way only someone trapped by their own lineage can. Her gaze traces the familiar Habsburg features, the long nose, the narrowing cheeks, the faint shadow of that infamous jaw. It's all there, the family's unspoken curse staring back at her. You can almost hear her think, "I carry their faces. I carry their ghosts." Maria Anna's story, like so many royal women, was written in ink long before she was old enough to hold a quill. Born in Vienna in 1606, she was betrothed to Philip III's son, her own nephew, when she was barely a teenager. Her duty was clear: unite Austria and Spain once more through marriage, strengthen the Habsburg line, secure the will of God on earth. Her own desires were not invited to the table. Imagine her voyage from Austria to Madrid, weeks on the road, the clatter of carriage wheels, the smell of rain-soaked horses, the weight of the future pressing against her ribs. Behind her, Vienna faded. Ahead, a palace full of strangers who would soon become family in ways too close for comfort. Historians still debate whether Maria Anna loved her husband. Some say there was mutual respect, a quiet affection that grew out of duty. Others describe a relationship colder than the marble floors they walked upon. What's certain is that she understood her role perfectly: to produce heirs, to embody virtue, and to conceal fear. In private letters to her confessor, she wrote of her loneliness. The walls here listen more kindly than people. She also confessed her worry for her children's health, noting their frequent fevers and weak constitutions. You can hear the tremor in her words, the dawning awareness that the family's obsession with purity was creating something sickly, fragile. There's one poignant entry, possibly apocryphal but achingly believable, where she wrote, "Sometimes I dream of faces I cannot name. They all have my eyes." It's as if she could sense the future, generations repeating her features, her burdens, her sorrow. She turns from the mirror and moves to a writing desk, scattered with letters. You lean closer, and through the fog of centuries, you can almost read the names: Ferdinand, Philip, Leopold. Each one a piece of the same puzzle. Each one another reminder that she was both aunt and wife, mother and cousin, queen and prisoner. In her own way, Maria Anna became one of the few stabilizing forces in a fractured court. Her intelligence and political instincts earned her influence, though always in whispers and suggestions. She advised her husband, mediated between factions, and tried to maintain dignity amid decline. The Spanish Empire was already dimming, its silver fleets pillaged, its colonies restless. The Queen's presence offered the illusion of order, even as she watched her own children's health falter one by one. There's a painting of her still hanging in Vienna today. Serene expression, elaborate ruff, a faint sadness behind her eyes. Most viewers never notice, but if you look closely, Her right hand clutches a small crucifix so tightly that the knuckles are pale. Faith, perhaps, or fear, maybe both. Historians still argue how much she knew about the genetic fragility within her family. Some claim she dismissed it as God's will. Others think she understood but had no power to change it. Either way, she bore it silently, as queens were expected to. Her own son, the future Charles II's father, would pass the same inheritance down the line, a dynasty built on vows that looked holy and felt like chains. You imagine her returning to that mirror late at night, after the candles in the palace have burned down to stubs. Her reflection meets her gaze again, a queen crowned in sorrow. Maybe she whispers a prayer, not for glory or empire, but for escape. Maybe she wonders what her life might have been if she'd married a stranger instead of her kin. The thought would have been treason. She likely pushed it away. The mirror flickers again, and for an instant, you think you see another face there, one not yet born, carrying the same jaw, the same eyes, the same fate. It's Charles II, faint and ghost-like, centuries compressed into reflection. His tragedy, her consequence. The dynasty has already written him into being, though she will never meet him, and that's the quiet horror of the Habsburg story, isn't it? Every generation looked in the mirror and saw both past and future staring back, themselves, multiplied and diminished. You take one last look at Maria Anna, still standing in the candlelight, trapped between faith and fatalism. The mirror doesn't move, but the reflection feels alive. It's the face of a woman who knew the cost of keeping power pure, and paid it with her peace. You move quietly now, past the mirror where Maria Anna's reflection lingers, and find yourself in a long corridor lined with painted nursery scenes, tiny princes and princesses in miniature armor, baby queens in brocade. The air feels lighter here at first, but only for a moment. Because behind the portraits of these royal children lies another story, childhood without freedom, and innocence traded for dynastic duty. You stop before a portrait of a little girl with golden hair tied in ribbons, a Habsburg archduchess, perhaps 7 years old, holding a small caged bird. Her face is solemn, her dress heavy. The artist has captured that eerie tension, beauty and captivity, youth and burden. The inscription beneath reads, Infanta Margarita Theresa of Spain. You've seen her before, the same child in Velázquez's Las Meninas, immortalized amid her attendants, unaware she would soon be married off to her own uncle. This is the beginning of many such stories. The Habsburg children were raised like prized relics, protected, worshipped, but never free. From birth, their lives were mapped with treaties and alliances, their bodies considered property of empire. Tutors taught them Latin, French, and theology, but never choice. Imagine growing up in such a world. Your nursery surrounded by portraits of relatives who all look vaguely like you, each one a ghostly twin. Servants bow when you enter. Priests tell you that your bloodline was chosen by God, and yet, every mirror reminds you that you are not entirely whole, that your family's perfection has cracks you must pretend not to see. Historians still argue about the emotional lives of these children. Some accounts describe them as precocious and proud, aware of their sacred lineage. Others, especially the letters of tutors and governesses, hint at loneliness bordering on despair. One wrote of the young Archduchess Maria Antonia, she clings to her dolls as if they are her subjects. Another recorded that a young prince would burst into tears at the sound of wedding bells, associating them with the day he would be sent away forever. You picture their childhood lessons, endless hours practicing etiquette, bowing, dancing, learning to pray correctly. The tiniest slip, a dropped fork, a crooked curtsy, could earn a scolding from courtiers who saw children not as people, but as symbols. A careless archduke dishonors his house, one etiquette manual warned. Childhood was performance art, and yet, amid all the rigidity, there were fleeting glimpses of tenderness. One governess recalled the young Infanta Maria Anna sneaking out to feed the palace swans breadcrumbs by hand. Another remembered the future Emperor Ferdinand IV, laughing uncontrollably when his tutor tried to explain Latin verbs through pantomime. Small human moments, swallowed by history's grandeur. But it's hard not to sense the shadow behind it all. These children were growing up in families already showing the physical marks of inbreeding. Frail limbs, receding jaws, chronic illness. The royal doctors kept meticulous notes. though few dared link the symptoms to their causes. The young prince's teeth are malformed, one report might say, or Her Highness struggles to breathe in cold air. Each line, a coded message of decay. When they weren't ill, they were lonely. Visitors often described the royal nurseries as too quiet. No laughter, no shouting, no chaos, just obedience. One ambassador visiting Madrid noted with mild horror that the young Charles II, even as a child, sat silently among his toys, waiting for permission to move. It wasn't cruelty exactly, it was indoctrination. These were children taught to believe their worth existed only through others' expectations. You can almost hear the lullabies sung to them, solemn hymns disguised as cradle songs. Sleep, my child, for kings must not dream too loudly. The melody echoes through centuries. As they grew older, their playtime turned to ceremony. The girls practiced walking in long skirts until their calves bruised. The boys were taught to ride horses and recite prayers, often both before breakfast. A Habsburg never stumbles, one tutor said, and meant it literally. Even childhood was rehearsed perfection. There's a peculiar tenderness in imagining the moments that broke through the protocol. A young princess sneaking a pastry from the kitchen, giggling as her nurse scolds her in whispers. A teenage prince rolling his eyes at yet another Latin lesson. For a second, they're not archdukes or future emperors, they're just children trapped inside a story written by adults. Historians still debate whether these isolated upbringings contributed to the later instability seen in rulers like Charles II. Some say yes, that generations raised in gilded isolation learned obedience but not resilience. Others argue that by the time of his birth, no amount of playtime could have changed the genetic tide. But all agree that the Habsburgs created a paradox. Children raised to rule the world, yet forbidden to live in it. You walk past one last portrait, a young boy with large eyes, his hand resting on a globe. His expression is solemn, too old for his age. The globe beneath his fingers glows softly in the candlelight, like a world both within and beyond his grasp. He doesn't know yet that the lands he touches will one day slip away, just as his family's power will. You pause in the silence and feel an ache for all those tiny ghosts, children born to reign, never to laugh freely, their destinies written in ink and chromosomes. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a music box plays, a lullaby that never quite ends. And as you walk on, you can't help but think, no one ever asked the Habsburg children what they wanted to be when they grew up. The answer had been decided before they were even born. The next corridor opens into a vaulted apothecary hall, the air thick with the smell of camphor, rosewater, and crushed herbs. You've stepped into the world of remedies, the royal cures that promised salvation and often delivered suffering. Here, medicine was part science, part superstition, and entirely faith. The wooden shelves bow under the weight of glass jars filled with powders, oils, and things better left unexamined. You run your fingers along the dust-covered labels. Essence of viper, oil of ambergris, powdered pearl, distilled frog spawn. Every ingredient seems plucked from an alchemist's dream or nightmare. In this room, the physicians of the Habsburg courts fought their quiet war against heredity, even though they didn't know that's what they were fighting. Picture the royal doctor, cloaked in black, a ruff framing his face like a halo of anxiety, standing over a pale young archduchess. Her pulse is faint, her breath shallow. He offers her a tincture of gold dissolved in wine, swearing it will fortify her royal humors. Around him, servants murmur prayers. The girl swallows obediently. The doctor sighs with relief. It's the same medicine he gave her cousin last month, and her cousin's cousin the year before. The results, of course, never change. The treatments were endless and often bizarre. Mercury was used to stimulate vitality. Cupping left bruises shaped like halos. Bloodletting was a favorite, a ritual so routine that basins engraved with the Habsburg crest were kept in the medical chambers. Imagine the irony. Royal blood literally drained to purify what centuries of inbreeding had already corrupted. Historians still argue whether the doctors believed in what they were doing. Some clearly did, the most educated men of their age. Trained in universities where medicine was still shackled to astrology and religion. Others knew better but kept their silence. You didn't tell an emperor that the problem was divine punishment or genetic ruin. You prescribed lavender oil instead. There's a strange tenderness to it all. The physicians weren't villains, just men born before the dawn of modern science, caught in the tragedy of serving gods who bled like mortals. One Spanish physician, Francisco de Villafranca, kept a diary describing the illnesses of the royal children. Between the careful Latin notes, melancholia persists, skin pallor unchanged. You find a single sentence written in despair. I think the blood itself is weary. You linger over those words. The blood itself is weary. How many lives, how many prayers were spent trying to revive it? The remedies grew stranger as desperation deepened. Powdered coral was stirred into milk for vital glow. Mummified. Remains? Yes, literal ground-up mummy dust imported from Egypt, were mixed with honey and eaten as medicine. Royal pharmacists traded relics like currency. A saint's finger bone here, a lock of hair from a virgin martyr there. It's grotesque, yet also profoundly human. The endless attempt to control what cannot be controlled. The most famous prescription in Habsburg history came from Charles II's final physicians. His body, they said, was a theater of contradictions. Swollen yet frail, cold yet fevered. They advised a tonic made of iron filings, crushed emeralds, and rhino horn. Modern biologists would call it poison. The court called it hope. Still, there were moments of dark comedy. One report from the Austrian court mentions an emperor who refused to take his prescribed leeches. They are too undignified, he supposedly said, before ordering the leeches applied to a servant so he could absorb their courage by proximity. The servant fainted. The emperor called it divine success. Sometimes the physicians prescribed nothing, merely rituals disguised as medicine. A queen was once told to sleep with a holy relic tied around her waist to cure infertility. Another was advised to wear red silk stockings to strengthen the womb. The symbolism was so thick that science couldn't breathe. You can almost hear the whispers that filled this room. More mint for the queen's cough. Boil another leech. Fetch the priest. Each command a small prayer in the language of futility. And yet the Habsburgs' wealth meant they had access to the best medical minds in Europe. Scholars from Padua, Paris, and Salamanca all walked these halls, bringing the latest theories of humors, bile, and celestial influence. But no amount of learning could outthink what was happening inside the royal bloodstream. Historians still debate whether anyone connected the dots, whether some quiet mind among these physicians realized that the problem wasn't demons or diet, but the repetition of ancestry. Perhaps someone did, and simply never said it aloud. In monarchies built on divine order, truth was the most dangerous prescription of all. There's a haunting footnote in one Viennese record. A physician named Johann Feuerbach refused to continue, treating the imperial children, citing unnatural conditions of kinship. His contract was not renewed. The line ends there, like a sentence left unfinished. You imagine standing here at dusk, the last light flickering through colored glass bottles, illuminating the dust like drifting spores of memory. The shelves seem endless, the jars silent witnesses to centuries of noble suffering. The cures, the failures, the faith, all of it preserved in amber. And perhaps that's the tragedy that hums in this room. The Habsburgs' doctors were not healing the body. They were trying to heal history. Every tonic, every prayer, every desperate experiment was an attempt to rewrite the past, to make the family tree bloom again. But nature, patient and indifferent, simply waited. You walk toward the door, the echo of footsteps blending with the imagined clink of bottles behind you. Somewhere, far away, a bell tolls the hour. A sound that feels less like time passing and more like the heartbeat of inevitability. The next chamber opens like a wedding dream. Bright silks, perfumed air, and a dizzying tangle of names that all sound the same. You've stepped into a royal ballroom prepared for yet another Habsburg wedding. A celebration of empire disguised as a love story. Gold threads shimmer in candlelight. Musicians tune their lutes, and somewhere behind a curtain, a young couple prepares to meet. Cousins, of course, though no one says it aloud. It is 1666, and the guests murmur excitedly about the perfect union. The bride is Infanta Margarita Theresa, the same little girl from Las Meninas, now 15. The groom is her uncle, Emperor Leopold I of Austria, 26 years old and bearing the same long face, the same gentle deformity of the jaw. The matchmakers call it destiny. You might call it déjà vu. The guests raise their glasses, unaware they're toasting another round in the family's long duel with genetics. Or perhaps they know and simply don't care. Politics has always been louder than biology here. The priests call it divine will. The diplomats call it victory. The bride calls it duty. Imagine the scene. Trumpets blare as she enters the chapel, her gown so heavy with jewels she can barely walk. Courtiers wipe tears from their eyes, not from emotion, but from the incense smoke that thickens the air. The groom waits at the altar, smiling stiffly, his periwig powdered, his breath sweetened with cloves to mask the faint metallic tang of nerves. Historians still argue whether Margarita understood the implications of her marriage. Some say she was well educated, fully aware of her royal role. Others believe she remained naive, a child swept into a web woven generations before. Letters from her attendants describe her as gentle, obedient, fond of music and prayer. One added delicately, "Her Majesty's health is delicate, but her spirit is unbroken." The ceremony itself is beautiful, almost cinematic. Choirs sing, candles drip wax like slow tears. When the priest pronounces them man and wife, applause erupts, echoing through the cathedral. You can almost hear the creak of corsets, the rustle of fans, the faint sighs of relief from ambassadors who've just secured another alliance. But in the quieter corners of the palace, whispers bloom. She looks pale. He looks tired. Will she bear sons? Because behind every royal wedding was a ledger. Names and numbers of heirs, pregnancies, alliances, dowries. Love wasn't part of the arithmetic. After the wedding, the new empress moved to Vienna, where she became both adored and pitied. Leopold genuinely seemed to love her, writing affectionate letters filled with awkward poetry. "My angel, my star, my joy," he called her, a rare tenderness in dynastic marriages. But love doesn't dilute chromosomes. Within 6 years, Margarita gave birth to 4 children. Only one survived past infancy. The others died before their first birthdays. Victims of what doctors called divine mystery, and modern science would call congenital failure. The court physicians prescribed the usual remedies: powdered coral, holy water, endless prayers. Nothing helped. Each funeral procession was shorter than the last, until Vienna's bells seemed to toll in rhythm with her labored breathing. Margarita herself died at 21, her body worn out by childbirth, her face, as one courtier put it, radiant and exhausted. Leopold mourned her deeply, but the machine did not stop. Within a year, new marriage negotiations began. Another cousin, another alliance, another attempt to patch the crumbling tapestry of royal blood. You can almost hear the scratch of pens drafting fresh contracts before the flowers on Margarita's grave have even wilted. Historians still debate whether Leopold ever questioned the pattern. Some claim he confessed privately to a Jesuit advisor, saying, "We preserve the line but lose the lives." Others argue he saw tragedy as divine testing, not consequence. What's certain is that the family's marriages continued as before, each one cloaked in splendor but shadowed by repetition. And repetition has its own eerie beauty. Every portrait from this era looks almost identical. Pale skin, almond eyes, long jaw, small mouth. The royal painters didn't have to invent likeness. They just copied what nature had already replicated too perfectly. Even the wedding portraits blur together, the bride's faces indistinguishable except for the jewels they wear. There's a curious story from the Vienna archives. A servant claimed that one evening, years after Margarita's death, Emperor Leopold stood before her portrait and whispered, "Forgive me." No one knows if the story is true, but it feels right. Guilt, like heredity, lingers quietly, passed down in gestures and silences. You imagine walking through the ballroom after everyone has gone. The candles burn low, the floor sticky with spilled wine. The music has stopped, but echoes remain. Laughter, clinking glass, the faint rustle of satin. On the table, 2 goblets still sit side by side, one slightly smaller than the other. The air smells of roses and regret. And maybe that's the essence of these cousin marriages. Not wickedness, not ignorance, but inevitability. The Habsburgs weren't trying to destroy themselves. They were trying to preserve everything they thought sacred. It just so happened that their god was inheritance, and their prayers were written in chromosomes. As you turn toward the next door, the candlelight catches on the mirrored wall, and for an instant, all those royal faces seem to look back at you, not accusingly, but with a strange tenderness. They didn't know what they were doing. They were trying to keep the world from changing, and the cost was simply everything. The ballroom fades behind you, and in its place rises a vaulted study, its walls lined with astronomical charts, old genealogical scrolls, and strange copper instruments that glint like relics of forbidden knowledge. This is where the Habsburgs' most secret fear took shape. Not in the chapel or the throne room, but here, in numbers and ratios and the unspoken math of blood. You find a candle burning low beside a parchment covered in interlocking circles, the family tree. It sprawls like ivy across the page, looping back on itself, cousin connecting to cousin, aunt to nephew, until the ink forms a labyrinth. At first glance, it's orderly. Look closer, and you realize it's collapsing inward. A court scholar once described it as a garden that prunes itself. Another, more cynical, called it a snake eating its tail. You can see both truths here. The Habsburgs believed they were perfecting their lineage. In reality, they were building a closed loop, a genetic echo chamber. You run a finger down the chart and pause on a familiar name, Charles II of Spain. The scholars of today would measure his coefficient of inbreeding at 0.25, the same as if his parents had been siblings. To put it plainly, his family had folded in on itself so tightly that he inherited nearly identical copies of many genes. Nature loves diversity. The Habsburgs loved repetition. Nature, patient as stone, simply waited for its due. But no one in the 17th century spoke that language. They spoke of humor's omen's divine will, and yet some seemed to sense the truth. You imagine one scholar, maybe an alchemist or physician, scratching numbers onto the edge of a royal portrait, trying to express in ink what he could not say aloud. 6 marriages in 4 generations, he might mutter. Too close, far too close. Historians still argue about when awareness turned to dread. The Spanish Habsburgs surely saw the signs, the frail heirs, the constant miscarriages, the widening jaws and narrowing hopes, but they called it destiny, not design. The Austrians, slightly luckier, convinced themselves it was a Spanish flaw, not a shared inheritance. Denial was their most enduring tradition. You glance at one of the strange instruments on the table, an astrolabe engraved with both stars and names. The royal astrologers used it to chart marriages as if they were constellations. If Venus favors Aries, one might say, the union will be fruitful. But even the stars, it seems, grew weary of repetition. There's a small journal open beside the parchment, the handwriting delicate, the ink brown with age. It's unsigned, but the tone is weary, almost confessional. We count the years, the births, the stillbirths. We trace the faces and see the same. The blood narrows. The spirit narrows with it. But who will tell them? That question hangs heavy in the room. Who could have told them? In a world where kings were chosen by God, to question their biology was to question heaven itself. Even if someone had dared, no one would have listened. Power deafens. Still, you sense that the math was there, hiding in plain sight. The courtiers may not have known the word recessive, but they knew patterns. How traits echoed from grandparent to child. How certain faces appeared again and again. The court painters, especially, must have seen it most clearly. Their brushes traced the same lips, the same tilted eyes, the same stubborn chin across centuries of canvas. One of them, the painter Juan Carreño de Miranda, reportedly joked to a friend, "I do not paint people. I paint one face over and over, and it moves from cradle to coffin." The humor was soft, but the truth stung. You step closer to the table and notice a scrap of vellum pinned beneath a glass weight. It bears a single phrase in Latin, "Non miscere sanguinem est miscere malum." To not mix blood is to mix evil. The handwriting is hurried, almost frightened. Perhaps someone in this very room realized the secret years before genetics gave it a name. Historians still debate how far the inbreeding extended beyond Spain and Austria. Britain, France, and Portugal all shared their royal DNA. But the Habsburgs perfected it, not through malice but through obsession with divine order. To them, purity was not danger but virtue. The idea that something invisible could destroy them seemed absurd. You pick up a faded ledger and skim the entries. It reads like both inventory and eulogy. Born weak, died young, born still, married cousin, married niece. The rhythm is hypnotic, tragic, almost liturgical. By the final pages, the handwriting trembles, the ink smudged by what might be tears. The last entry, no heirs. And yet, amid all the despair, there's something strangely human here. The unrelenting hope that next time it will be different, that next time God will bless the union. It's the same stubborn optimism that built empires and destroyed them. You move toward the window where moonlight cuts across the genealogical chart like a silver thread. The inked lines shimmer faintly, as though alive. For a moment you imagine they're pulsing, the royal blood still flowing, the old names whispering through time. Ferdinand, Maria Anna, Charles, Leopold. Each one is both ancestor and descendant, caught in the same circle. You feel the eerie beauty of it, the pattern too perfect, too fragile, destined to collapse. And as you turn to leave, the candle guttering behind you, the room seems to breathe out one last sigh, the sound of history acknowledging its own arithmetic. The scent of wax and parchment fades into something heavier, iron, sweat, and incense. You're standing now in a grand hall of the Alcazar of Madrid, its marble floors polished by centuries of ceremony. Above you hangs a tapestry depicting Spain's golden age, ships, saints, and kings. But the colors look faded, the thread unraveling. This is where the empire begins to die, not with rebellion or conquest, but with exhaustion. You can feel it in the air. The year is 1690, and Spain, once the richest realm in the world, is a shadow of itself. Its silver fleets from the Americas arrive half empty. Its armies lose battles to nations once thought beneath them. And at the center of it all sits King Charles II, the last of his line, fragile, childless, and visibly deteriorating. The courtiers whisper, of course. They always whisper. They say the king's body mirrors his kingdom, frail, haunted, unsustainable. His reign is a long twilight, the sun of empire sinking slowly behind the Pyrenees. You picture him now, seated on his throne, wrapped in ermine that looks too heavy for his thin shoulders. His eyes are distant, his mouth slack from the weight of that unmistakable jaw. He tries to sign a decree, but the pen trembles. A minister discreetly guides his hand. The document is finished. A law passed, an illusion maintained. Historians still argue how much Charles understood. Some call him a tragic innocent, others a paranoid mystic. But most agree on this. His condition symbolized a dynasty's collapse. He was less a man than a prayer, one chronicler wrote, uttered too often and never answered. You step closer, and you can almost smell the mixture of perfumes and decay that filled the royal court. To outsiders, the Alcazar still glittered, but behind its walls, decay had a sound, coughing servants, clinking rosaries, and the dull scrape of wheels carrying the ailing king from one room to another. The Queen, Marie-Louise of Orléans, was young and lively, a breath of French elegance amid the gloom. But even she could not outrun the curse. She suffered repeated miscarriages, blamed herself, fasted, prayed, and died at 26, leaving Charles lonelier and more desperate than ever. Rumor said she had been poisoned. The truth, as always, was probably simpler. The dynasty had simply run out of life. After her death, the king remarried, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg, chosen for her family's supposed fertility. The court physicians examined her horoscope with enthusiasm. A strong line, one declared. Many sons will come. None did. Within a year, she was another ghost drifting through the palace, clutching rosaries and letters from home. Even the clergy began to waver. Was God truly with Spain, or had he turned his face away? The royal chaplain preached that suffering purified the soul, that the king's weakness was divine proof of his holiness. It was a brilliant piece of theological spin. If strength was impossible, sanctify weakness. But outside the palace, the people were starving. Famine swept Castile. Plague returned to Seville. Gold from the Americas vanished into the pockets of foreign bankers. The empire that had once ruled the seas could barely feed its own. And still, the bells of Madrid rang daily for Mass, echoing the same prayers that had long ago ceased to work. You can almost hear one of those sermons now, the echoing voice of a bishop declaring, "Spain suffers because she is chosen." The congregation nods, too weary to argue. Perhaps they even believe it. A kingdom dying of faith in its own perfection. One. peculiar document survives from this era, a letter by a royal accountant named Alonso di Ucheda. He described inspecting the treasury and finding more cobwebs than coins. "The nation," he wrote, "has eaten its future." His handwriting trembles toward the end, as if the ink itself is tired. Historians still debate whether the empire's decline was inevitable. Some blame economics, others politics, others divine irony. But as you walk the halls of the Alcazar, it feels simpler. A kingdom that could not change was bound to crumble. The same stubborn purity that shaped its royal blood had shaped its institutions. Rigid, ornate, and brittle. A wind rattles the windows. You imagine the sound of distant gunfire. Wars fought for pride the treasury can't afford. The Spanish Netherlands slip away. Naples rebels. Even in the New World, conquistadors' grandchildren grow restless, dreaming of independence. The empire is too large for its frail heart, and through it all, the king prays. Every night, Charles kneels in his private chapel for hours, begging for an heir, a miracle, or just understanding. He believes his suffering keeps Spain alive. One of his confessors records a haunting moment. His Majesty asked if perhaps his blood displeased the Lord. The priest assures him it does not. But the question lingers. Outside the chapel, servants wait in silence. One whispers, "The king bleeds through the mouth again." Another replies, "Then the empire bleeds too." It's a grim poetry the Habsburgs would never have allowed in public. But the servants, closer to truth than anyone, understood. By now, even the diplomats are growing restless. They write letters to foreign courts describing a monarch barely human. One French envoy, the Marquis de Villars, famously reported, "The king's death will be the birth of war." He was right. As the candles burn low in the Alcazar, you can feel time stretching thin. The empire is not yet gone, but it no longer breathes freely. Its palaces echo with memory more than laughter. The portraits on the walls look less like ancestors and more like reminders. A dynasty folding in on itself, carrying an entire continent down with it. You glance toward the throne once more. The king still sits there, motionless, eyes glazed, lips moving in silent prayer. The courtiers bow and withdraw. Outside, thunder rolls over Madrid, and for a fleeting second, you think it sounds like a dying heartbeat. The golden age of Spain has ended, not with a battle, but with a whisper. The thunder you heard over Madrid has passed, but its echo lingers in the corridors. You find yourself standing outside a bedchamber guarded by candle-bearing attendants in black. Their faces are pale, their eyes heavy. The faint scent of wax and dying flowers clings to the air. Inside, the last Habsburg of Spain, King Charles II, lies dying. The room is dim and stifling. Tapestries hang thick against the walls to block drafts, but they only trap the heat and the smell of sickness. The king's bed is high and ornate, its curtains embroidered with the Virgin Mary and golden cherubs. He lies beneath them like a child swallowed by a cradle too grand for his frail body. You approach slowly, and for a moment the decades fall away. The trembling boy you saw in earlier rooms is here again, still small, still frightened, still waiting for permission to breathe. His face is pale as parchment, his jaw slack, his body twisted slightly to one side. Each breath sounds like paper tearing. A priest kneels nearby, whispering the final prayers. The courtiers stand motionless, terrified of breaking the ritual silence. The queen weeps quietly, clutching a rosary, but even her sobs are subdued, the court etiquette still in force. Death, too, must be dignified. Historians still argue over Charles II's final hours. Some claim he was lucid enough to dictate his will, choosing a successor in the hope of saving his country from chaos. Others say he drifted in and out of delirium, mumbling about spirits and ancestors calling him home. One chronicler wrote, "He spoke as if to ghosts seated around his bed, naming them one by one. The royal physicians hover nearby, their faces drawn. They've tried everything, infusions of gold dust, baths of milk and rose water, prayers at every shrine within reach. None of it worked. One of them, perhaps the most honest, has already written in his notes, 'His Majesty's body cannot hold his soul much longer.' You glance at a small table beside the bed, a chalice of holy water, a silver cross, a lock of his first wife's hair, and a tiny glass locket. Objects of comfort for a man who never found any. He opens his eyes once, briefly, and for a heartbeat, you see the boy he might have been. Curious, lonely, human. Then his gaze drifts upward toward the crucifix above him. The priest's voice trembles. May the Lord receive your soul as he has guided your reign. The irony hovers unspoken. The reign has been one long requiem. Outside, the bells of Madrid wait, silent for now. The courtiers have already begun rehearsing what comes next. The formal announcements, the morning close, the diplomatic letters that will ripple across Europe. They know that when those bells toll, not just a king, but an era will end. It's strange watching the death of both a man and a myth. The Habsburgs had built their dynasty on divine legitimacy, kings by God's hand, blood pure, power eternal. And yet here lies the last of them, gasping for breath, surrounded by relics that never worked. For all their rituals, no one in this room can change what's written in his bones. A chamberlain steps forward and checks the pulse at the king's wrist. The silence deepens. He nods to the priest. The final words are spoken, requiescat in pace. The priest makes the sign of the cross. The queen collapses into a chair, sobbing softly. The courtiers bow their heads. You watch as the candles flicker, tiny flames trembling as though the air itself mourns. Outside, the first bell tolls. Then another. Then another. Slow, deliberate, final. Historians debate the exact moment the empire died. Some mark it at the signing of the will, when Charles named Philip of Anjou, grandson of France's Louis XIV, as his successor. Others say it ended now, in this room, as the candles burned low and the bloodline finally failed. The truth is that both are the same. The will hastily written is as much plea as decree. I give Spain to a prince who will love her as his own, Charles had said. It was both selfless and tragic. By doing so, he handed his empire to France, igniting the War of Spanish Succession, one last inferno sparked by the ashes of his lineage. You stand still as attendants move silently around the bed, drawing the curtains closed, placing coins on the king's eyes, arranging his hands upon his chest. The ritual has been rehearsed for centuries. No one needs instruction. The body becomes sacred the instant it ceases to rule, and yet even now there's no peace. In a nearby chamber, courtiers are already whispering, France or Austria, Bourbon or Habsburg. The ink on the will isn't even dry, and Europe is preparing for war. Death is never the end of politics. You look once more at the still figure beneath the embroidered canopy. His lips are slightly parted, his face calm for the first time in years. Whatever haunted him, sickness, guilt, prophecy, has finally gone quiet. The empire, too, rests in uneasy silence. Outside, rain begins to fall on the tiled roofs of Madrid. The thunder rolls again, gentler this time, like a sigh. The bells continue to toll, not just for a king, but for a dynasty that mistook eternity for inheritance. When you turn to leave, you notice a tapestry near the doorway, the Habsburg coat of arms, its once vivid colors now faded to gray. The double-headed eagle looks tired, its wings drooping. It was meant to symbolize dominance over East and West. Now it seems to mourn both. As the final candle sputters out, the room darkens into stillness. The lineage that once ruled the world has ended with a whisper, and the sound of distant thunder folding into silence. The candles have burned out, but the story doesn't end with death. You find yourself in a vaulted hall, cold and echoing, where the smell of wax has been replaced by the sharp tang of ink and paper. The courtiers have dispersed, the priests have gone, and now the doctors, the same men who could not save the king, gather to dissect the only truth they can measure. This is the royal autopsy. The final investigation of a dynasty's collapse. The year is 1700. Spain is silent under mourning veils. Yet within the palace walls, a small group of physicians huddle over Charles II's body, stripped of its silks, lying pale upon a wooden table. The air is heavy with the weight of centuries. Every incision they make will be history's verdict. A scribe stands nearby, ready to record every detail. He dips his quill, and the first note of the autopsy is almost poetic in its horror. The body of His Majesty was found in a most deplorable state. You lean closer, in your imagination, of course, and watch as they begin their grim work. One physician mutters a prayer, another adjusts his spectacles. The first incision draws no blood. The veins are nearly dry. They open the chest and find the heart of the size of a peppercorn. The lungs corrupted. The intestines putrefied and full of worms. The liver, they note, black as coal. but it is the head that draws the most attention. When they remove the skull cap, they find what the records describe as a head full of water. Hydrocephalus, modern science calls it, a symptom of genetic degeneration. At the time, it was seen as divine mystery, another sign that the king's suffering was sacred. The physicians write carefully, aware their words will echo far beyond this room. The report concludes with a line so strange it feels like prophecy. His body contained no blood. His heart was the size of a nut and his head full of water. Truly, he was more dead than alive. Historians still debate whether this account was exaggerated, a political weapon to justify the new Bourbon rule that followed. Some suggest the doctors embellished their findings to dramatize the fall of the Habsburgs. Others insist the description, horrific as it is, fits perfectly with Charles's lifelong ailments. Either way, the image is unforgettable, a body that embodied the exhaustion of an empire. You can almost hear the quill scratching as the scribe copies the report for the council. The ink spreads slowly, each word sealing the dynasty's fate. Across the hall, the queen, Maria Anna of Neuburg, prays beside a covered crucifix. She's the last to leave, weeping quietly as the doctors wash their hands and pack their instruments. Outside, thunder rumbles again. The world beyond Madrid already stirs. Ambassadors race to claim the throne. Generals march toward borders. The ink of one death sparks a dozen wars. The autopsy becomes legend. It travels from court to court, copied, retold, embellished. In Paris, they whisper that the Habsburg blood had turned to water. In Vienna, they insist Spain's decay was a moral warning. In London, pamphlets mockingly dub him the king who outlived his body. But you linger here, in this cold hall, trying to see beyond the mockery. The body on the table isn't just a man, it's a mirror. You see in him the cost of purity, of fear disguised as faith, of pride mistaken for destiny. One physician, perhaps the youngest, the one who still believes in reason, pauses before leaving. He looks at the shrouded body and murmurs, "The bloodline is finished, but the lesson remains." He doesn't write it down. History rarely records the quiet truth. As the men depart, servants enter to prepare the final rituals. They wash the body in wine and herbs, wrap it in linen, and place it in a gilded coffin. The royal crest, that double-headed eagle, gleams faintly in the candlelight. Its wings seem too heavy now, burdened by failure. Historians later note how Spain's ambassadors described this funeral. The procession was magnificent. Torches, hymns, soldiers in black armor. The streets filled with the scent of myrrh. But beneath the splendor was fear. Everyone knew what the king's death meant. Europe would soon bleed again. Indeed, within months, the War of Spanish Succession erupted. France, Austria, Britain, and countless others clawing for the empire's remains. All that gold, all that faith, all those marriages, and now the world tore itself apart over what was left. You walk slowly through the now empty hall. The floorboards creak under your feet. The autopsy table stands abandoned, a single candle burning beside it. The flame bends in a draft, wavering like memory. For a brief, eerie moment, it feels as though you can still hear the heartbeat of the Habsburg line. Faint, distant, fading beneath centuries of ambition. And then silence. The ink is dry. The body is gone. But the story remains. Not of death, but of inevitability. The hall of autopsy fades behind you, replaced by the solemn grandeur of Vienna once again, the city that refused to die with Spain. The Austrian branch of the Habsburgs, still strong, still fertile, still defiant, takes the torch their cousins have dropped. The marble streets of the Hofburg echo with new ambition, and the air smells not of mourning, but of strategy. You step into a chamber lit by 1,000 candles reflected in crystal mirrors. Ministers whisper around a map of Europe, tracing new borders, drafting fresh alliances. The empire has shifted, no longer the sprawling Spanish colossus, but a leaner, more disciplined machine of diplomacy and bureaucracy. The Austrian Habsburgs have learned from the fall of Madrid, or so they think. But even as they speak of modernizing armies and reforming trade, the old habits remain. Marriage is still the empire's weapon of choice. The same pattern continues, cousins, nieces, nephews, just rearranged into new configurations of power. "We will not repeat Spain's mistakes," one courtier says. "We will simply repeat them better." Historians still argue whether Vienna truly learned anything from Madrid's collapse. Some say the Austrians recognized the dangers of inbreeding and began seeking alliances beyond their kin. Others point out that the Habsburg obsession with keeping the faith, both Catholic and familial, was too deep to uproot. Either way, the dynasty pressed on, its heart now beating from the banks of the Danube. You can feel the optimism in the city. The court is alive again. Music, laughter, and the faint promise of enlightenment. Composers like Fuchs and later Haydn will fill these halls with symphonies meant to drown out centuries of whispered decay. The empire's colors, once faded, seem newly bright. But beneath the surface, the ghosts still linger. The portraits of their Spanish relatives still hang in the galleries. Pale faces with sad eyes, reminders of what happens when power becomes obsession. Visitors note how the Viennese Habsburgs keep those portraits covered during balls, as if embarrassed by their reflection. "We do not speak of Spain," one court lady tells another, and everyone nods politely. You move into a smaller room, the emperor's private study. It's lined with books, maps, and family miniatures. On the desk lies a letter from the Pope, praising Austria's renewed strength against the Ottoman Empire. Another letter, unsigned, warns of the dangers of marrying too closely again. The emperor sighs and sets it aside. Politics demands proximity. Proximity demands family. One marriage soon becomes the talk of Europe. Leopold I's son, Joseph the Mark, weds Wilhelmina Amalie of Brunswick-Lüneburg, a match outside the Habsburg circle. Fresh blood, some whisper approvingly. But Joseph dies young, and his daughters are married back into the same web. The cycle flexes but never breaks. Still, the Austrian court begins to cultivate a new image, not of divine kingship, but of enlightened leadership. The ministers speak of reason, progress, education. The empire funds academies, sponsors scientists, builds libraries. But the bloodline remains old-fashioned, a relic wrapped in silk. "We are modern minds in ancient bodies," one archduke supposedly joked, unaware of how literal that sounded. You can almost see Maria Theresa, not yet empress but already formidable, walking these corridors as a young woman. She listens, learns, and remembers. Her father, Emperor Charles II, obsesses over the pragmatic sanction, a legal masterpiece ensuring his daughter's right to rule. He spends decades convincing every court in Europe to accept it, yet fails to prepare her for the empire she'll inherit. Exhausted, debt-ridden, and surrounded by enemies. When Charles VI dies in 1740, the ministers swear allegiance to her. But within weeks, rivals pounce. The War of the Austrian Succession erupts, and once again, Europe bleeds because of the Habsburgs. It's a grim inheritance, yet Maria Theresa meets it with unflinching resolve. You can almost hear her voice, low, steady, commanding, as she addresses her council. "I am but a woman, yet I am also your king." Historians still debate how much her rule changed the family's destiny. Some call her the dynasty's savior, others see her as its last true monarch. But even she could not escape the shadow of her bloodline. Her marriage to Francis Stephen of Lorraine brought a flicker of new vitality. 16 children, strong alliances, but also carried traces of the same old calculation. Keep the blood close, keep the throne safe. Vienna under Maria Theresa flourished outwardly. Reforms, universities, music. Yet behind the glitter, you sense her private anxiety. She ordered physicians to keep detailed health records of her children, fearful of the Spanish legacy returning. And though she insisted on piety, she quietly allowed her daughters to marry further afield. One of them, Marie Antoinette, would later pay a different kind of price for being born a Habsburg. The Austrian branch survived where Spain failed, but it wasn't victory, it was endurance. The empire would rise and fall again, reshaped by revolutions and wars, yet always bearing the same signature jawline in its portraits. The family had learned to adapt politically, but biologically the lesson took longer to sink in. You look around the emperor's study one last time. The candles flicker against a row of miniature portraits. Charles V, Philip II, Leopold I, Charles II. 4 centuries of rulers stare back, their faces merging into one. It's as if the dynasty itself is speaking, whispering from beyond history. We endured because we believed we must. Outside, the bells of Vienna toll midnight. The empire breathes, not thriving, not dying, just existing. like a great creature too ancient to vanish, and though the Spanish line lies buried, its echo still hums beneath the marble floors. You leave the chamber quietly, stepping into the moonlit courtyard, where statues of past emperors stand frozen in triumph. Their stone eyes glint in the darkness, watching you go, as if even in death, the Habsburgs insist on bearing witness to their own survival. The courtyard fades, and you drift through a passageway lined with white marble busts. Stern faces, powdered wigs, eyes of carved stone. You can almost hear the faint rustle of silk skirts and the clink of jeweled rosaries. Ahead, the sound of distant music, a harpsichord, steady and serene. You've entered the age of Maria Theresa, the woman who refused to let the Habsburgs fade into obscurity. She's not yet the grandmotherly matriarch history remembers. Right now, she's young, fiercely intelligent, and terrifyingly determined. The empire is trembling beneath her feet. Prussia has invaded, France is circling, Britain is bargaining. And yet, amid all this chaos, she's sitting by candlelight drafting plans, not just for war, but for survival. The scent of ink and beeswax fills the room as she writes. She's thinking always of the bloodline. Spain is gone. The Austrian branch is all that remains. Her father's dream, the pragmatic sanction, has bought her a crown, but not security. Every royal court in Europe doubts her, partly because she's a woman, partly because she's a Habsburg. They think the line has run dry, she mutters to her advisor. Then let us prove it still breathes. Her first act is both political and personal. She strengthens the family through new marriages. Not just cousins now, though old habits die hard, but calculated alliances that stretch further across Europe than before. Bohemia, Hungary, Lorraine, Savoy, each union is a chess move. And in the middle of this delicate game, Maria Theresa marries for something close to affection. Her husband, Francis Stephen of Lorraine, is kind, clever, and just ambitious enough to understand her world without being consumed by it. Their partnership becomes one of the few in Habsburg history marked by genuine companionship. You can almost see them walking through the Schönbrunn Palace gardens, the air thick with roses and politics. She asks his opinion on trade, on military reforms, even on religion. He smiles, perhaps realizing he's the first Habsburg consort whose wife truly governs. Still, the old rules persist. Their children must marry strategically, their bodies remain symbols of power. Historians still argue about Maria Theresa's motivations. Was she a reformer moved by compassion or a strategist preserving the crown? The truth lies somewhere in between. She reformed education, taxed the nobility, streamlined bureaucracy. But every policy also served one deeper purpose: to keep the Habsburg heart beating. At night, though, when the ministers leave and the music dies, she writes letters filled with worry about her children's health. Their marriages, the shadow of the Spanish line. Our blood is not cursed, she writes in one, but it is burdened. You can feel the weight of centuries pressing on that word. Her fear isn't superstition, it's memory. She knows the portraits of her ancestors too well, the hollow eyes of Charles II, the twisted features of the old kings. The physicians in Vienna have begun studying anatomy with new eyes, whispering theories about inheritance and hereditary weaknesses. She listens but never comments. Perhaps she's too wise to speak the truth aloud. The court around her thrives in disciplined splendor. Servants move like clockwork, courtiers bow like choreography. There's a sense of renewal here, candlelight gleaming off polished marble, a faint hum of industry. Yet behind the progress lies fragility. The empire is enormous, its bureaucracy suffocating, its people restless. Reform is survival, not comfort. Maria Theresa is both mother and monarch. 16 children, each a potential alliance or liability. You picture her sitting at a desk surrounded by portraits of them. Joseph, the heir, brilliant but volatile. Leopold, methodical. Maria Christina, her favorite. And the youngest, Maria Antonia, the child who would one day become Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, and lose her head to another kind of inheritance. Even in motherhood, Maria Theresa is imperial. She tracks every cough, every fever, every potential suitor. When one of her daughters falls ill, she writes in the margin of a state document, "Pray God it is not the weak lungs again." The line sits between reports of tax revenues and army movements, a queen blending empire and motherhood in the same ink. Her rule lasts 40 years. Under her, the Habsburgs regain their footing, modernize their armies, reform their universities, and even dare to flirt with Enlightenment ideals. Philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau write letters praising her intellect, though she privately despises their irreligion. Let them play with reason, she tells her confessor. We rule by faith. Historians still debate whether she ever truly understood how fragile her achievements were. One wrote, "She preserved the dynasty by sewing silk over stone." It's true, beneath all her reforms lay the same old contradictions. Progress yoked to piety. Intelligence constrained by legacy. As she ages, her face hardens, her eyes grow sharp. The portraits show her draped in ermine, jaw firm, gaze unflinching. The Habsburg jaw again, softened but unmistakable, not just an inheritance of flesh, but of will. Near the end of her life, she orders a mass in memory of the entire Spanish line. "For they died believing they served God," she says softly. It's not mockery, but kinship, an acknowledgement that the ghosts of Madrid still whisper through Vienna's marble halls. When she finally dies in 1780, the empire mourns as though it's losing its mother. Bells toll across Europe, and even her enemies admit admiration. Yet history will always read her life with a quiet irony. She preserved the Habsburgs just long enough for the world to change beyond them. You walk once more through her chamber. The candlelight trembles. On her desk lies a half-finished letter to her son Joseph, the next ruler. Her final words are underlined twice. Never forget what ruin pride brings. Outside, the wind stirs the curtains of Schönbrunn. Somewhere in the gardens, the roses rustle faintly, and for the first time in generations, they're blooming freely. The scent of roses from Schönbrunn fades, replaced by the faint smell of wax, ink, and perfume, the smell of letters written in candlelight. You're in a quiet salon now, somewhere deep within the palace. A small fire crackles. Papers are scattered across a desk, the wax seals half melted in the heat. These are not state decrees or treaties. They're love letters, written in the looping. Desperate script of royals who've mistaken affection for diplomacy. It's easy to forget that even dynasties this careful occasionally stumbled into tenderness. Here, between wars and reforms, between treaties and baptisms, you find the fragile thread of emotion. Love trying to survive inside the machinery of empire. You pick up one of the letters. It's from Archduchess Maria Christina, Maria Theresa's favorite daughter, to her husband, Albert of Saxony. She had been allowed to marry for love, the only one of 16 children granted that freedom. Her mother's condition was cruel but clear. You may marry your heart's choice, but only if you never ask for the crown. Maria Christina agreed. Her letters overflow with warmth and devotion. The days without you are as long as my mother's counsels. You can almost hear her laughter hidden in the ink. Then another letter, much darker in tone. It's from Archduke Joseph, the future emperor, writing to his confidant, not a lover, not officially, but something dangerously close. He complains about loneliness, about the weight of duty. I'm surrounded by people and still alone. They speak of loyalty, but not of honesty. Even power, it seems, could not protect the Habsburgs from isolation. And then there are the physician's letters, not of love, but of curiosity. One, written by a young court doctor in the late 18th century, marvels at what he calls the mystery of inheritance. There are patterns. Majesty, he wrote to Maria Theresa's successor. Traits that pass unseen through the generations. Beauty, frailty, temperament. It is as if God keeps a secret ledger. His tone is reverent, not yet scientific. The word genetics doesn't exist yet, but the intuition flickers like a match in the dark. Historians still argue when the Habsburgs first began to understand their own biology. Some say not until the 19th century. Others point to fragments like this. Love letters doubling as medical records, physicians whispering theories they dared not publish. In a family where everything was sacred, even science had to kneel. There's one particularly haunting document you can almost see in your hands, a folded parchment labeled Private Correspondence, 1774. Inside, a dialogue between a court scholar and an artist. The scholar, fascinated by hereditary features, asks the painter whether he's noticed the pattern of the royal jaw. The painter replies dryly, "Sir, I notice it every day." The chin paints itself. You laugh softly, but the humor is tinged with unease. The artists of Europe were the first to record the dynasty's decline in plain sight. While ministers spun illusions of divine perfection, portraitists quietly documented reality. Pale skin, heavy eyelids, lips too small for the breadth of the face. They captured what no physician could say aloud, that history itself was visible in bone. You move to the next stack of letters. These are between Maria Theresa's younger children, Leopold and Maria Carolina, discussing politics and family. Between the lines of their formal language, something tender flickers. "Do not let our mother's worry consume you," Maria Carolina writes. She means to save us all, but she forgets that love does not follow policy. How many centuries had passed since a Habsburg could write such a sentence? And yet, affection in this family always came entangled with strategy. Maria Theresa's descendants were scattered across Europe like seeds. One queen in France, one in Naples, one emperor in Vienna. Every letter between them is both personal and political. "My dearest sister," one begins, "our mother's health fails. I fear the empire will follow." The handwriting falters halfway through. A tear, perhaps. Or maybe just fatigue. Even romance in this family could not escape the shadow of heredity. Court gossip whispered that Joseph II's melancholia was inherited from his grandfather. Others said his temper mirrored his father's. The royal physicians recorded these traits as though logging the weather. His Majesty suffers periods of gloom. Her Highness displays nervous agitation. The Habsburgs, even in love, were case studies in legacy. But amid the clinical observations and political marriages, there are glimpses of something human. A note from Maria Christina again, older now. "If I could have chosen freely for all my siblings, perhaps our line would have been happier, if not stronger." It's the most subversive thing a Habsburg ever wrote. The quiet acknowledgement that survival isn't the same as living. Historians still debate whether this generation, Maria Theresa's children, sensed the fragility beneath their empire's splendor. They inherited palaces, armies, and endless paperwork, but also the accumulated exhaustion of a family that had carried Europe's history for too long. You sit at the desk, surrounded by the whispers of these letters: love, duty, confession, regret. The wax seals gleam faintly in the candlelight, like tiny hearts preserved in amber. One last letter catches your eye. The handwriting is uncertain, almost shaky. It's addressed simply, "To whoever remembers us." Inside it reads, "We were not cursed. We were afraid, and fear makes poor medicine." You fold the letter carefully and set it back among the others. Outside the window, snow begins to fall over Vienna. The flakes drift slowly past the palace lamps, soft and soundless. Somewhere a harpsichord still plays, a melody gentle enough to lull history itself to sleep. The snow thickens outside Vienna, blanketing the cobblestones in quiet white. You drift through the chill corridors of Schönbrunn, where time itself seems to slow. Servants move silently, wrapping portraits in cloth to keep out the winter damp. The empire has entered a new century, and so have you, into the age of Joseph II. The restless son who dreams of remaking everything his mother built. You find him alone in his study, surrounded by stacks of paper and the faint smell of candle smoke. His hair is unpowdered, his waistcoat slightly rumpled, scandalously plain by Habsburg standards. The clock strikes midnight, but Joseph keeps writing, his pen scratching like a heartbeat. "Freedom of thought," he murmurs. "Freedom of the press. Freedom from superstition." Words that could have burned him a generation ago now hang in the air. Dangerous, but exhilarating. Joseph is the empire's great reformer, the Enlightenment prince who wants to drag Austria into reason. He abolishes torture, opens hospitals, grants religious tolerance, and insists that graves should be simple. No gold, no vanity. Historians still argue whether he was a visionary or a meddler, but there's no denying the scope of his ambition. "Everything for the people, nothing by the people," he liked to say, and he meant it. But beneath his idealism, the family shadow persists. The courtiers still whisper of hereditary ailments, still compare jawlines and portraits. Joseph's own health is fragile. He suffers from chest pain, perhaps tuberculosis, perhaps nerves. Some say he inherited his melancholia from his mother's line. Others say from the weight of his own conscience. He feels too deeply for a ruler, one minister sighs. You imagine him looking at his reflection in the dark window, the candlelight turning his features spectral. The chin, the lips, the long nose, all echoes of the same dynasty that refuses to fade. He hates it, perhaps. He wants to be modern, rational, free of the past. But the mirror tells another story. In his reign, the empire begins to crack under the strain of progress. The nobles grumble, the church seethes, the peasants stare blankly at his decrees. They wanted bread, I gave them laws, he jokes bitterly. Still, he keeps working, a lonely machine of reform in a world that prefers ceremony. Meanwhile, the rest of the family continues its ancient rhythm of births, marriages, and alliances. His sister, Maria Carolina, rules Naples with her own brand of steel. Another Marie Antoinette, now Queen of France, plays at enlightenment with silk ribbons and powdered hair. She writes letters back to Vienna, full of charm and exhaustion. I am surrounded by luxury, yet sleep evades me. Historians still debate whether Maria Theresa's children ever understood what their family represented to the rest of Europe. To the philosophers, the Habsburgs were relics. To the priests, divine guardians. To the common people, they were distant, untouchable, like gods with fragile bones. And yet Joseph II wanted to break that image. He visited hospitals incognito, spoke to workers, even dined with common soldiers. A king who eats alone dies alone, he once said. But the courtiers mocked him. They preferred masquerades to policy, incense to logic. His loneliness grew like mold behind the gilded walls. You can sense his frustration in the stillness of the palace. Papers pile up, reforms stall, ministers resign. In his final years, Joseph writes a melancholy decree asking that his heart be buried separately, a Habsburg tradition turned confession. Let it rest where it may find peace, he scribbles. Even in death, he couldn't stop dissecting himself. The empire mourns him in silence. No grand funeral, just a plain coffin and the sigh of Vienna's winter wind. When the procession passes through the streets, the people remove their hats not in reverence, but confusion. Was this man their savior, or just another emperor with too many ideas? After his death, his brother Leopold II takes the throne, cautious, calculating, the balance to Joseph's feverish zeal. He undoes many reforms but keeps the spirit of modernization alive. The Habsburgs, it seems, have learned once again to adapt without changing too much. You walk through the garden terraces that Joseph II once loved, now silent under snow. The statues wear white caps of frost and the fountains stand still. Somewhere in the distance, a carriage rattles, another envoy arriving from Paris, carrying news of revolution. That revolution will devour one of their own, Marie Antoinette. Her death will shake Vienna to its core. Joseph is gone, but his ghost might have nodded grimly. So much for enlightenment without caution. For now, though, the night holds its breath. The empire stands, bruised but intact. You can almost hear the city murmuring in sleep, scholars debating in taverns, priests whispering prayers, soldiers dreaming of tomorrow's drills. Inside the palace, a single candle still burns in Joseph's old study. The flame wavers but doesn't die. It's the perfect metaphor for the Habsburgs. Fragile, flickering, but impossibly persistent. You turn to leave, your footsteps echoing down the long marble corridor. Behind you, the candle gutters once, twice, and then steadies again as if the emperor himself refuses to let go. You emerge from the frozen hush of Joseph's Vienna into the trembling heat of Paris. 1789. The air smells of smoke, sweat, and ink. The revolution has begun, and its echoes reach all the way to the Danube. Somewhere in the roar of the Parisian crowds, another Habsburg heart beats faster. It belongs to Marie Antoinette, the daughter of Maria Theresa, the queen whose head will become a symbol of everything her dynasty once represented. You see her standing at the window of Versailles, dressed in pale silk, her face composed yet hollow. Beyond the gates, the people chant her name, not in adoration but accusation. Madame Deficit, they call her, as if she alone is responsible for centuries of hunger. You can almost hear the tremor in her breath as she whispers, "They hate me because I am foreign." She's right, of course. To them, she is the embodiment of Austria's arrogance, a Habsburg in every syllable. Historians still argue whether Marie Antoinette truly deserved her infamy. Some portray her as frivolous, more interested in hairdos than hunger. Others insist she was a scapegoat, a young woman trapped in politics she barely understood. What's certain is that her blood carried the same mixture of pride and vulnerability that had haunted her family for generations. In the beginning, she tried to charm France. You picture her walking through the Hall of Mirrors, curtsying with that famous poise inherited from her mother. The courtiers smile, but their eyes are cold. She doesn't speak perfect French, and every gesture of foreignness becomes a weapon against her. When she builds a little mock village, her Hameau de la Reine, to play at peasant life, the people of Paris whisper that she mocks their suffering. Still, there's a strange kind of humanity in her defiance. Courage, she writes to her brother Leopold II, now Emperor of Austria. Courage is the one thing they cannot tax. It's the wry humor of someone raised to rule but forced to survive. As the revolution deepens, letters begin to flow between Vienna and Versailles like lifelines. Secret ink, hidden couriers, desperate pleas. The Austrian court debates whether to intervene, whether to save their daughter. But politics moves slower than mobs. By the time Leopold hesitates, it's already too late. You find yourself standing in the chill of the Temple prison. The walls are damp, the candles dim. Marie Antoinette sits at a small table, her hair cut short, her hands folded in her lap. Once the symbol of elegance, she now looks like every exhausted mother in history. She murmurs to her son, teaching him prayers. "Repeat after me," she says softly. The boy barely whispers. The sound is swallowed by stone. When the trial comes, the charges are absurd: treason, corruption, immorality. But the verdict was decided long before the first witness spoke. On October 16, 1793, she walks toward the guillotine in a plain white dress. The crowd screams. She keeps her eyes forward. When she steps on the executioner's foot, she apologizes. "Pardon me, sir. I did not do it on purpose." It's the last echo of her royal upbringing, grace surviving horror. Historians still debate what that apology meant. Some call it tragic dignity, others call it habit. But either way, it feels like the perfect summary of the Habsburg legacy. Centuries of ceremony reduced to a moment of quiet composure in the face of chaos. As her head falls, the crowd roars. Yet for a fleeting second, silence seems to ripple across Europe. A strange, heavy pause, as if the entire continent realizes what it's done. The revolution has not just killed a queen, it has severed the thread that tied divine monarchy to myth. Back in Vienna, the news arrives with the Winter Courier. The Empress's descendants receive it in stunned silence. Leopold's ministers burn letters, fearing reprisal. And somewhere deep in Schönbrunn Palace, an old chambermaid lights a candle for the little queen. She places it beside a miniature portrait of a smiling girl, Marie Antoinette at 15. Before the crown, before the hatred. You imagine the candle flickering all night, its flame bending in the draft but never extinguishing. Another Habsburg light lost, but not forgotten. The tragedy ripples outward. Across Europe, monarchs tighten their grip, terrified that revolution will spread. In Austria, reforms halt. Censorship grows. The same empire that once flirted with enlightenment now recoils into fear. "We have seen what liberty brings," one minister says. "We prefer obedience." The irony is almost unbearable. Joseph II's dream of a rational, humane Europe has ended not in enlightenment, but in terror. The Habsburgs retreat into conservatism, rebuilding walls both literal and political. The blood of Marie Antoinette becomes a warning, not just to her family, but to every royal house that still believes in divine order. And yet, you can't help feeling that her death, for all its horror, marked something necessary. The old world had to crumble for the modern one to breathe. The Habsburgs will adapt again, as they always do, trading crowns for diplomacy, trading divine right for quiet persistence. Outside, the snow melts into slush. Paris buzzes with the rhythm of a new age, republics, constitutions, chaos. But somewhere in Vienna, the candle still burns, a small defiance against the cold. You linger there in the dark, listening to the silence after centuries of noise. And for the first time, you sense that even the mighty Habsburgs have learned something simple, that no bloodline, however ancient, can escape the turning of the world. The candle that flickers for Marie Antoinette seems to cast its light across all of Europe, and when you blink again, the scene has shifted. Vienna is still the same in many ways, elegant, meticulous, wrapped in lace and discipline. But beneath the surface, a new heartbeat is emerging. The year is 1804. The French Revolution has burned itself out, and in its ashes, a new emperor rises, Napoleon Bonaparte. You stand in a grand hall of the Hofburg Palace. The air tense as diplomats whisper in half-sentences. The Habsburgs, once rulers of half of Europe, now face an empire that threatens to devour them whole. Napoleon's armies have already crushed the Holy Roman Empire, the very institution the Habsburgs once used to justify their divine rule. The First Empire of Austria is born not from triumph, but from necessity. The man who leads it is Francis II, later Francis I of Austria, cautious, deliberate, and painfully aware of his family's fading aura. You can almost feel his reluctance as he signs the decree dissolving the Holy Roman Empire. 1,000 years of imperial legacy reduced to ink and paper. Better to destroy it ourselves, he mutters, than watch it be destroyed by another. The courtiers bow their heads, but the silence that follows is heavier than any prayer. Historians still debate whether Francis truly understood how final that act was. Some claim he believed the empire could return when the French menace passed. Others argue he knew exactly what he was doing, saving what little dignity remained. Whatever the truth, the Habsburgs have now been forced into something they've always avoided: evolution. And then, as though fate itself insists on irony, Napoleon sends a letter to Vienna. Not a threat, but a proposal. He wants to marry Francis's daughter, Marie-Louise, uniting the French and Austrian empires by blood. The room goes still. The courtiers exchange looks of horror. An Austrian princess, the granddaughter of Maria Theresa, marrying the man who dismantled their world. Francis hesitates for days, pacing these same marble corridors you now walk. Every portrait on the wall seems to glare at him, the long line of ancestors who built their power through marriage. In the end, the logic is inescapable. If we cannot defeat him, Francis sighs, we will join him. And so another Habsburg daughter becomes a pawn. But Marie-Louise is no Marie Antoinette. She's practical, soft-spoken, resigned. At 20, she marries Napoleon by proxy, and soon after, is shipped to Paris, the same city that once guillotined her aunt. The French call her l'Autrichienne again, the same cruel nickname, but this time without laughter. You picture her on the day she arrives in Paris, her pale blue gown fluttering in the spring wind, her expression carefully neutral. He is not so terrible, she writes home after meeting Napoleon. He speaks kindly, and I am treated as empress. It's a letter written by someone too intelligent to believe her own words. The marriage produces a son, the King of Rome, Napoleon's long-awaited heir. Vienna exhales in cautious relief. At least she is safe, Francis says. But the safety doesn't last. Napoleon's empire burns bright and fast, and when he falls, Marie-Louise is left stranded between two worlds, too Austrian for the French, too French for the Austrians. She returns home eventually, but not to Vienna's warm embrace. Her father greets her politely, but never intimately. The Habsburgs do not forgive scandal, even when it's strategic. Marie-Louise lives out her days quietly, governing the small Italian duchy of Parma. She writes to her old French ladies-in-waiting about gardens, weather, and music, never about her husband or her son, who will die young in a lonely Austrian palace, his name erased from history. Historians still debate whether Marie-Louise loved Napoleon. Some say she pitied him, others that she admired his brilliance. But her silence after his exile says more than any diary could. I did what duty required, she once told a confidant. That sentence could be carved on every Habsburg tomb. Back in Vienna, the empire rebuilds itself carefully, like a wounded animal. The Congress of Vienna in 1815 turns the city into the diplomatic capital of the world. Ballrooms sparkle again, and the waltz, that new scandalous dance, sweeps through the aristocracy. For a brief moment, the Habsburgs seem to have mastered survival once more, not by conquering, but by hosting. Let others make war, Prince Metternich famously quips. Austria makes marriages. And yet, beneath the chandeliers and laughter, something has shifted. The old conviction of divine purpose is gone, replaced by weary pragmatism. The Habsburgs are still powerful, but now they rule through compromise and charm instead of fear and faith. Their portraits grow softer, their eyes more reflective, as if they too are beginning to understand what history has made of them. You step outside into the Vienna night. The music from the palace drifts through the cold air. Violins, laughter, champagne glasses clinking. The empire has reinvented itself yet again, this time as the ballroom of Europe. But the dance hides exhaustion. Every waltz turns into a repetition of the same step, the same rhythm, the same survival. For centuries they've danced, with Spain, with France, with death itself. Now the partners have changed, but the song remains the same. You look back once more at the palace windows, their golden light reflecting on the Danube. Somewhere inside, Francis the Theresa sits alone, tracing his finger over the family tree, a map of centuries of marriages, wars, and regrets. He stops at one name, sighs and murmurs, "We are still here," and that, for the Habsburgs, has always been enough. Vienna glitters like a jewel again, but the shine hides 1,000 cracks. The year is 1848, the year Europe catches fire. The streets are filled with revolutionaries, the smell of gunpowder and smoke clinging to the cold air. The people chant for freedom, for constitution, for bread, and inside the Hofburg Palace, the Habsburgs, the oldest dynasty in Europe, sit in terrified silence, wondering whether history has finally come to collect its debt. You find yourself in a dim council room. The portraits of emperors loom overhead, stern and watchful. The current ruler, Ferdinand Theresa, sits slumped in his chair. He is gentle, kind, and utterly unsuited to govern an empire in flames. His health is poor, his mind weaker still. The whispers of the court physicians are soft but merciless. Epilepsy, confusion, childlike behavior. Some say it's the return of the Habsburg inheritance, the soft echo of centuries of inbreeding. "Shall we send troops, Majesty?" one minister asks. Ferdinand blinks slowly, unsure. "Yes, but give them cake first," he mutters, his words trembling into nonsense. The room falls silent. Historians still debate whether the quote is apocryphal, but it feels true enough to the moment. The empire's once iron will has melted into hesitation. Outside, the revolution spreads. Vienna's students march with tricolor flags. Hungarian nationalists demand autonomy. Italian rebels drive Austrian garrisons from their cities. For the first time in living memory, the empire looks mortal. You walk through the palace corridors, the air thick with fear. Courtiers pack trunks, clerks burn papers, guards whisper about mutiny. The empire's centuries-long balance of power has collapsed into panic. And in the center of it all sits an emperor who can barely comprehend his own title. Historians still argue about who truly ruled Austria during this time: Ferdinand, his uncle Archduke Louis, or the formidable Chancellor, Prince Metternich. It's Metternich, of course, who understands what must be done. He spent decades weaving diplomacy like lace, keeping Europe stable by sheer willpower. But now the threads snap all at once. He flees the city in disguise, muttering, "The old order is gone." And yet, in the chaos, another figure rises. A boy, barely 18. Franz Joseph, Ferdinand's young nephew, suddenly finds himself emperor of a crumbling empire. He's handsome, disciplined, and already trained to embody duty the way his ancestors wore crowns. His mother, the fierce Archduchess Sophie, whispers, "You were born for this." He believes her. You can almost see him standing on the balcony overlooking the Ringstrasse, his face pale but resolute as he addresses the crowd. The people cheer, not out of love, but relief. Someone, anyone, who looks like he knows what he's doing. "I will restore order," he declares. And for the next 68 years, he will try to do exactly that. But order comes at a price. The rebellions are crushed. Hungary is subdued after a brutal campaign. Thousands are imprisoned or executed. The empire survives, barely, but the wounds never heal. Franz Joseph has learned his lesson early. Compassion is weakness. In private, though, the new emperor is not unfeeling. You can picture him writing letters late at night, his handwriting neat, his words precise. "I have inherited too much. Too many borders. Too many ghosts." The portraits of his ancestors hang around him like silent judges. Charles V, Maria Theresa, Joseph II, all watching. The young emperor vows never to repeat their mistakes. But what does that mean when every Habsburg mistake is also tradition? Historians still debate whether Franz Joseph ever loved the empire he ruled or merely endured it. His reign becomes a paradox, the most stable period in modern Austrian history, and also its slowest decline. Under his rule, railways expand, industries grow, cities flourish. Yet politically, the empire fossilizes. Reforms are resisted, nationalism festers, and the emperor's iron discipline becomes both his strength and his curse. And through it all, one constant remains: family duty. Franz Joseph marries his cousin, the spirited Bavarian Duchess Elizabeth, better known as Sisi. Their union, meant to symbolize stability, becomes another Habsburg tragedy in slow motion. But that's still to come. For now, the palace breathes again. The smoke of revolution fades, replaced by the polite murmur of diplomacy and the scent of polished marble. The Habsburgs have survived another crisis, though no one can quite explain how. You wander out into the early morning light, where the city looks deceptively peaceful. The Danube glints silver. The carriages roll once more. A group of young officers pass you, laughing softly, unaware that they are walking on the embers of what nearly destroyed their empire. Vienna exhales. For now, the storm is over. And yet, you can't shake the feeling that history is simply pausing, drawing a breath before the next act. The Habsburgs have survived revolutions, diseases, and dynastic implosions, but the cracks in their foundation are widening. Somewhere deep within Schönbrunn, perhaps in an unused corridor, the family portraits still hang crooked, their painted eyes fixed on the future they cannot see coming. The dynasty endures, yes, but it no longer rules time. Morning comes to Vienna, pale, crisp, and deceptive in its calm. The empire has survived 1848, and with it, Franz Joseph has entered history as Europe's golden monarch. You find yourself standing at the gates of Schönbrunn Palace again, where soldiers in gleaming white uniforms drill with machine precision. The emperor's empire hums like a clock, every cog obedient, every tick carefully measured. From the outside, it's magnificent. Railways crossing the Alps, factories humming along the Danube, and the city itself transformed into a modern capital. The new boulevards of Vienna, the Ringstrasse, are lined with opera houses, museums, cathedrals, and cafes. It's an empire trying to make beauty a substitute for certainty. And yet, in the private chambers of the Hofburg, the emperor's life feels anything but orderly. Empress Elizabeth, or Sisi, glides through the palace like a ghost in satin. She's everything the Habsburgs are not: poetic, restless, rebellious. While Franz Joseph rises at 4 a.m. each day to sign decrees with military precision, Sisi spends hours riding horses, writing melancholic poetry, or staring out at the Alps as if the mountains could answer the questions her husband never would. You can almost hear their breakfast conversation, clipped, polite, filled with the silences of two people imprisoned in tradition. Sisi once told a lady in waiting, "I married a crown, not a man." Franz Joseph, for his part, called her mein Engel, my angel, but seemed bewildered by her need for freedom. Historians still argue whether theirs was a tragic love story or merely another arranged endurance. Sisi's beauty became legendary, waist corseted to 19 inches, hair so long it reached her knees, but her fragility was even more famous. She traveled endlessly, Greece, Hungary, Madeira, anywhere but Vienna. "I suffocate here," she wrote in her diary. The walls whisper obedience. And yet, her absence only made her myth grow. The people adored her precisely because she defied the image of the obedient empress. In Hungary, she became a symbol of unity. She even helped negotiate the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, which created the dual monarchy. While diplomats argued, she soothed hearts. The Hungarian nobles toasted her as their queen who speaks with warmth, not orders. But for every success, tragedy waited nearby, as if the Habsburg curse had simply changed shape. Their only son, Crown Prince Rudolf, was brilliant, sensitive, and every bit as restless as his mother. Franz Joseph, rigid as a metronome, couldn't understand him. "Duty is happiness," the emperor would insist. "Then why does it make you so sad?" Rudolf once replied, "You find yourself standing now in a hunting lodge at Mayerling, deep in the Austrian woods. The air is heavy with mist and secrecy. It's 1889, and a single gunshot has echoed through history. Rudolf and his lover, Baroness Mary Vetsera, are found dead, an apparent suicide pact. The imperial court seals the truth under layers of official statements and whispered denial. He was ill, one report claims. He died suddenly, says another. The priest refused to bury him in consecrated ground until the Pope intervenes. The Empress collapses, Franz Joseph withdraws into deeper solitude, and Europe begins to gossip about what the Mayerling incident truly meant. Historians still argue whether it was love, despair, or conspiracy, but to the world, it looked like the curse had returned. The dynasty that had survived revolutions and wars was now undone by loneliness and expectation. Sisi never recovers. You can almost see her wandering through the palace gardens at dusk, veil pulled low, her diary clutched like a secret. "I feel like a shadow among statues," she writes. "The world moves, but I no longer belong to it." In 1898, while traveling in Geneva, the inevitable finds her. A young Italian anarchist approaches her by the lakeside, pretending to stumble. He drives a thin file into her chest. She doesn't realize she's been stabbed until minutes later, when she collapses on the deck of a steamboat, murmuring, "What has happened to me?" Even in death, she's graceful, dying upright, refusing panic. When Franz Joseph receives the news, he says nothing for a long time, then whispers, "Now no one belongs to me anymore." You step back, letting the silence of the palace surround you. The mirrors, the chandeliers, the portraits, all unchanged, all watching. The emperor grows older, more mechanical, more alone. His empire, like him, is vast and weary. He works each day with monastic devotion, signing decrees until his hand trembles, eating the same meals at the same hour, mourning in the same chair for decades. He becomes a living monument, the embodiment of stability in an age that no longer believes in permanence. When new inventions appear, telephones, bicycles, electric lights, he nods politely and asks if they require permits. But outside, the world is shifting too fast even for him. New nations rise, ideologies spread, and the empires of Europe creak under their own weight. Austria-Hungary, held together by nostalgia and paperwork, feels like an elaborate illusion. You can almost hear the emperor sigh late one evening, alone at his desk. "I have outlived everything I understood." It's true. The world has changed. The Habsburgs remain, elegant, courteous, and quietly irrelevant. Yet there's something strangely comforting about their endurance. Like old marble, they don't shine anymore, but they refuse to crumble. In the stillness of Schönbrunn, you sense the empire holding its breath again. Somewhere deep in the palace, a clock ticks, precise, patient, unfeeling. Franz Joseph's reflection flickers in the window. Behind him, the portraits of centuries watch in silence. The dynasty still stands. But the future, that restless, democratic, unpredictable thing, is already knocking on the gates. The ticking of that Schönbrunn clock grows louder, echoing down empty corridors that once hosted emperors and ambassadors. You follow the sound and emerge into a new century. The year is 1914. The empire, old and sprawling, moves like a tired orchestra that's forgotten its melody. The musicians still play. The conductor still waves his baton. But everyone feels the rhythm faltering. Franz Joseph, now 83, still wakes before dawn to work through his mountain of paperwork. His hand trembles as he signs decrees, but his will remains iron. "The empire," he says, "endures through habit." The courtiers nod, relieved that someone still believes it. But outside Vienna, the world is slipping away. Nationalism, industry, and revolution all marching in step towards something no one can yet name. You walk beside him through the palace garden as he takes his morning stroll. The air smells of autumn, damp leaves and dying roses. "They call me a relic," he mutters to no one in particular. But relics are proof that something once mattered. He stops to feed a bird, as if even the sparrows need reassurance that Austria-Hungary still exists. The emperor's empire stretches across 11 nations, 15 languages, and nearly 50 million souls. An impossible patchwork held together by bureaucracy and nostalgia. The Hungarians resent the Austrians. The Czechs want autonomy. The Serbs plot revolution. And somewhere far to the south, in a small Balkan city few Viennese could locate on a map, a carriage turns a corner. It's June 28, 1914. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne, and his wife Sophie are visiting Sarajevo. They're an unlikely couple. He, stern and pragmatic. She, warm and grounded, not born of noble blood. Their love defied the Habsburg obsession with pedigree, and though it cost him influence at court, Franz Ferdinand refused to give her up. "Better a loyal heart than an empty title," he once said. It's almost romantic, until the world decides otherwise. You can see it play out in unbearable slowness. The motorcade gliding down the narrow street, the crowd cheering, the sudden confusion, the sound of gunfire. Gavrilo Princip, a young nationalist with shaking hands, fires 2 shots that change history. One strikes the Archduke, the other his wife. "Sophie," he whispers, clutching her hand, "don't die. Stay alive for our children." She doesn't answer. In Vienna, The telegram arrives hours later. The emperor sits motionless as he reads it. Then he closes his eyes and sighs. Another tragedy for my house. He pauses, then adds, God will not be mocked forever. Historians still debate whether Franz Joseph truly understood what had been set in motion. Some say he saw it instantly, that the assassination would ignite a war unlike any before. Others claim he welcomed it as a final test of loyalty for an empire grown restless. Either way, within weeks, Europe descends into madness. The First World War is unlike anything the Habsburgs have ever faced. Battles stretch across borders they used to draw by hand. Trenches carve through the soil of their own empire. Millions die in fields that once fed their people. The emperor, too old to lead, becomes a symbol. A portrait in every barracks, a name murmured in every oath. Soldiers go to their deaths whispering, "Für Kaiser und Reich," for the emperor and empire. You stand in one of those trenches now, mud up to your ankles, the smell of smoke and decay heavy in the air. The soldiers speak Czech, Hungarian, Croatian, German, a dozen tongues, all saying the same thing. We don't know what we're fighting for. In a way, they're right. The war that began as vengeance for a dead archduke becomes a slow suicide for an empire already dying. Back in Vienna, Franz Joseph works until his last breath. In November 1916, after 68 years on the throne, he finally closes his eyes. His last words are whispered to his aide. I am tired. He dies the way he lived. Quietly, stubbornly, surrounded by order. The city mourns him with genuine grief, not because the people still love monarchy, but because they fear what will come without it. His great-nephew, Charles I, inherits the impossible, an empire in ruins. A war it cannot win, and a family legacy that no longer commands reverence. You can almost pity him. He's young, idealistic, devout. Everything his time no longer rewards. I will bring peace, he promises his wife, Zita, and for a moment you believe him. But history isn't merciful. The war drags on, the fronts collapse, and by 1918, Austria-Hungary simply disintegrates. The emperor flees into exile. The royal flags come down from every building. In Budapest, Prague, and Zagreb, people tear down Habsburg crests with hammers and laughter. The empire that once spanned centuries vanishes in weeks. Historians still argue what killed it: war, nationalism, or inevitability. But the truth feels simpler. The Habsburgs had outlived their century. Their empire, built on arranged marriages and divine right, had no place in a world run by machines and republics. And yet, even in exile, Charles refuses to abdicate. A Habsburg does not resign, he says. Instead, he waits, quietly, pathetically, for a restoration that never comes. He dies young, coughing blood in a villa on the island of Madeira, his last words to his wife. I must suffer so my people may come together again. When news reaches Vienna, no one celebrates. There's no empire left to rejoice or to mourn. Only the memory, marble statues, faded portraits, and the long echo of a name that once meant power. You step out into the cold of a post-war Vienna. Small, fragile, uncertain. The great empire has shrunk to a city-state surrounded by borders it used to command. And yet the cafes are still full, the waltzes still play, and the people still speak softly of the Kaiserzeit, the emperor's time, as though it were a dream they once lived inside. The Habsburgs are gone from their throne, but not from memory. And sometimes, when the church bells ring at dusk, it almost feels like Franz Joseph is still there, signing papers somewhere deep within the walls of Schönbrunn, too stubborn to notice he's been dead for years. Vienna breathes again, but not the way it used to. The war is over, and with it, the last threads of empire have unraveled. The palaces still stand, but their windows are dark. The banners are gone, the guards dismissed, and the echoes of courtly etiquette have been replaced by the sound of trams and street vendors. The great Habsburg Empire, once the spine of Europe, now survives only as an afterimage, a faint hum of memory. You walk along the Ringstrasse, past the empty ministries and shuttered embassies. The cafes are full of veterans in threadbare coats arguing about socialism, art, and the price of bread. Somewhere, a young painter named Adolf sits sketching bitter dreams. The world is new, and yet the ghosts of the old one hover close. Inside Schönbrunn Palace, dust gathers on the chandeliers. The staff have been dismissed. The grand halls smell faintly of neglect. In one corner of a vast echoing salon, a caretaker sweeps the floor under portraits of emperors and queens. The eyes of Charles V, Maria Theresa, and Franz Joseph stare down from the walls, but no one salutes anymore. The Republic has stripped the Habsburgs of their titles, their lands, their possessions. A law passed in 1919 declares that any family member entering Austria must renounce all dynastic claims. No emperor shall dwell among a free people, one parliamentarian declares. The irony is thick. Freedom built on the exile of a family who once called themselves chosen by God. You picture Empress Zita, now widow to the last emperor, leading her children through a modest train station in Switzerland. The air smells of coal and snow. She carries herself with the same dignity as her ancestors, though her coat is worn and her purse nearly empty. Remember, she tells her son Otto, the new heir in name only, you are still a Habsburg. That means you serve. Historians still debate what she meant, service to faith, to people, or to a vanished idea. But the line lives on, whispered through generations. You drift through post-war Europe with her. Monarchies topple like dominoes. Germany's Kaiser, Russia's Tsar, the kings of Greece and Bulgaria. But the Habsburgs, resilient, spectral, refuse to vanish completely. They become wanderers instead of rulers, exiles with titles that sound like fairy tale relics. The family scatters across the globe. Some settle in Switzerland and Spain, others in Belgium and Mexico. Otto, the boy who once played in Schönbrunns gardens, grows into a scholar. He studies law, speaks half a dozen languages, and one day walks into the League of Nations as a private citizen. No crown, no throne, but the same Habsburg bearing. I am European by blood, he says, but a Democrat by choice. You can almost imagine the old emperors frowning in their frames. Yet somehow it fits. The dynasty that once ruled by divine right now learns to survive by intellect. For the first time in centuries, the Habsburgs begin to resemble ordinary people. Meanwhile, Vienna redefines itself, not as imperial capital, but as cultural refuge. Freud analyzes dreams in his office. Klimt's golden paintings still shimmer. Strauss waltzes echo in cafes filled with cigarette smoke. The empire may be gone, but its nostalgia has become an industry. Tourists flock to see the palaces, the carriages, the uniforms. It is easier to love the Habsburgs when they are gone, one writer quips. You find yourself in a museum now, where their world has been carefully embalmed. A mannequin wears Franz Joseph's military coat. Tiny, perfectly tailored, the cuffs threadbare from decades of daily use. Nearby, Cece's riding saddle gleams under glass, a symbol of restless grace. And there, in the next case, a delicate crown, the imperial diadem, resting on crimson velvet, dull under fluorescent light. You lean closer. The inscription reads simply, Austro-Hungarian Empire, 1867-1918, that's all. Centuries of ambition, marriage, and empire reduced to a label. But the story doesn't end here. The family continues to weave itself through Europe in quieter ways. Otto becomes a respected member of the European Parliament in the late 20th century, campaigning for unity instead of dominion. His sisters and cousins marry into other noble houses or live private lives as teachers, priests, and historians. No thrones, no crowns, just persistence. Historians still debate whether the Habsburg legacy was tyranny, tragedy, or stability. Some say they strangled progress. Others argue they preserved peace longer than any republic could. The truth, as always, sits somewhere in the middle, a contradiction as old as the dynasty itself. As you leave the museum, you glance back once more at the display. The faint reflection of your face appears in the glass beside the crown. For a moment, it looks as though the line has continued into you, as though history itself refuses to break cleanly. Outside, the streets of modern Vienna hum with trams and chatter. Children chase pigeons in front of the Hofburg gates. A man sells postcards of Franz Joseph's profile to tourists who barely remember his name. And above it all, the bells of St. Stephen's ring out, slow, resonant, unchanged. The empire is gone, but the sound remains, folding centuries into one long note. The Habsburgs may no longer rule, but they endure in the architecture, in the music, in the faint melancholy of a city that has learned to love its ghosts. The museum fades into dusk, and when you step outside, the city of Vienna feels older again, as if the ghosts have followed you into the street. The cobblestones echo with invisible footsteps, lace shoes, polished boots, whispers of servants hurrying down hallways that no longer exist. You can almost feel history brushing past your shoulder. The Habsburgs are gone, yet somehow still here, not as rulers, but as rhythm. The 20th century stretches ahead, and Europe is about to learn what happens when its old monarchies vanish and its certainties collapse. You drift through time, following the faint, stubborn pulse of the Habsburg name as it moves through exile, war, and reinvention. In the 1930s, Otto von Habsburg, son of the last emperor, is a young man now, tall, eloquent, and painfully aware of what he represents. He's both relic and possibility, the living echo of an empire that still haunts Europe's imagination. Some monarchists still dream of restoration. Others mock him as a prince without a country. "I am not my ancestors," he tells a reporter once, "but I am their consequence." It's a strange fate, to be born into a story everyone else has already finished. Otto spends his youth moving from one country to another as fascism spreads across the continent. In 1938, when Hitler annexes Austria, the Habsburg name becomes both threat and beacon. The Nazis despise him. They see the dynasty as the last symbol of a cosmopolitan Europe they want to erase. Hitler declares Otto an enemy of the Reich, sentencing him to death if captured, and so, the heir of centuries of empire becomes a refugee. You can picture him packing his suitcases, quietly helping his mother Zita and his siblings board a train through Switzerland to Portugal, then a ship to America. The family travels under assumed names. Once, the guards at a border crossing ask Otto who he is. "Just a student of history," he replies, not entirely lying. Historians still debate whether Otto ever truly wanted his throne back. Some say he secretly plotted to restore the monarchy after the war. Others insist he had already moved beyond it. What's clear is that he understood something his ancestors never did. That legitimacy in the modern world came not from blood, but from ideas. In exile, he writes articles, gives speeches, advocates for a unified Europe. "The tragedy of our house," he tells an interviewer in 1942, "was not that it fell, but that it could not change fast enough." You can hear both pride and melancholy in his voice, the tone of a man who still carries his history like a scar he refuses to hide. When World War II ends, the Habsburgs return to Europe, but not to power. Austria, under Allied occupation, bans them from entering unless they renounce their dynastic claims. Otto refuses at first, stubborn, principled, or perhaps simply haunted by the ghosts of pride that ruled his lineage. For decades, he lives in Bavaria, a royal exile watching his homeland from just across the border. In 1961, he finally signs the document renouncing his claim, allowing him to return home at last. Reporters gather at the airport expecting a grand gesture. Instead, Otto steps off the plane in a simple gray suit and quietly says, "It is good to be home." Vienna greets him not with fanfare, but with curiosity. The young see him as a museum piece. The old see him as a living memory. Yet he wins them over, not with grandeur, but with intellect. He speaks at universities, debates in parliaments, helps lay the groundwork for the European Union. He becomes not an emperor, but a bridge between past and future, between monarchy and modernity. You can almost imagine him walking through the city at night, unnoticed, passing cafes where portraits of Franz Joseph still hang. Perhaps he pauses at one, smiles faintly at the irony, and orders a coffee. The waiter doesn't recognize him, which might be the greatest gift history ever gave him: anonymity. Historians still argue whether Otto's transformation was redemption or adaptation. Some monarchists called him a traitor for embracing democracy. Others called him the dynasty's wisest heir. But for the first time in 600 years, a Habsburg learns to live without power and thrives. Meanwhile, the family continues to scatter quietly across continents. Some serve as doctors, scholars, priests. A few marry commoners. A few even joke about their famous jaw. "It's our family crest," one cousin laughs in an interview. You sense that the old arrogance has softened into something gentler. Self-awareness. Maybe even humility. In 1989, when the Iron Curtain falls, Otto watches the Berlin Wall crumble and whispers, "Europe is healing." He's old by then, but his faith in unity burns bright. "Our duty," he says, "was never to rule Europe, but to hold it together." You realize, standing there in the same city his ancestors built, that he's not wrong. For centuries, the Habsburgs had done exactly that. imperfectly, often disastrously, but persistently. And though their crowns turned to dust, the idea survived, that Europe's many nations could coexist under something greater than conquest, law, culture, cooperation. As night falls over Vienna, you walk past the palace where it all began. Lights glow faintly in the windows, illuminating nothing but furniture and portraits. Yet somehow the building feels alive. The empire may have died, but the architecture refuses to forget. You hear a faint sound, waltz music from a street performer nearby. The notes drift through the cold air, and for a heartbeat the city seems to dance again. It's a waltz not for emperors this time, but for memory itself. Gentle, tired, and beautifully human. The waltz drifts through the night, faint and familiar, a lullaby for ghosts. You follow it through Vienna's narrow streets, past the cafe windows and the lamplight reflecting on wet cobblestones. History is quieter now. The age of emperors is long gone, but the city still hums with their memory, like a violin note that refuses to fade. By the late 20th century, the Habsburg name has turned from political force into cultural echo. They are no longer rulers. They are stories, museum exhibits, footnotes. And yet those stories keep breathing. You find them in novels, operas, family trees, even in the shape of a chin on a modern face. The dynasty that once ruled half of Europe now lives through anecdotes, archives, and anniversaries. Somewhere, in a quiet Austrian village, an elderly woman pours coffee for a guest. Her name is Archduchess Regina, wife of Otto von Habsburg. The table is modest. No gold, no servants, just china cups and a small vase of flowers. On the wall hangs a photograph of Otto at a podium, speaking for human rights in the European Parliament. He never wanted pity, she says softly. Only purpose. Their children grow up far from the marble and ceremony of the past. They attend ordinary schools, study medicine, engineering, history. One daughter joins the Order of Malta. Another becomes a teacher. A son works in Brussels. They still carry titles, Archduke, Archduchess. But those words now sound quaint, almost theatrical. We serve through work, not crowns. One of them tells a journalist. Historians still debate what makes the Habsburgs endure. Some claim it's sheer luck. Others say it's the adaptability of faith. After all, this was a dynasty built not just on marriage, but on Catholic identity. The idea that their mission was divine. And even stripped of power, they cling to that mission's shadow. Duty, dignity, devotion. You find yourself standing once again in Schönbrunn Palace, now a museum, filled with tourists and schoolchildren. The air smells faintly of polish and paper. Guides speak in a dozen languages, explaining the grandeur that once defined the world. A little boy points at a portrait of Maria Theresa and asks, "Is she a queen?" The guide smiles. "She was," she says, and in a way, she still is. It's strange how quickly history softens when the people are gone. The cruelty, the control, the arrogance, all blur into elegance. The monarchy has become nostalgia, its sins repainted as sophistication. They built the empire. One sign reads, that gave Europe its heart. You can't help but smile at the irony. For centuries they ruled by divine right. But in the end they are remembered for music, art, and pastry recipes. The modern Habsburgs live mostly quiet lives, but occasionally one steps into the public eye. Weddings draw cameras, funerals fill cathedrals. When Otto von Habsburg dies in 2011, his funeral in Vienna becomes a spectacle of memory. Thousands gather along the streets to watch his coffin pass, not as subjects, but as witnesses to the last chapter of an old story. The ceremony unfolds with ritual precision, echoing the funerals of his imperial ancestors. The coffin is brought to the Capuchin crypt, the resting place of 145 Habsburgs. The Capuchin friar knocks on the door. "Who seeks entry?" a voice asks from within. "The Emperor Otto of Austria," replies the herald. "We know him not," comes the answer. The herald knocks again. Otto, a mortal and a sinner. The doors open. It's the same ritual performed since the 17th century, a reminder that even emperors enter death as equals. You can almost feel the chill of the stone crypt as the coffin passes inside, joining 6 centuries of ancestors in silence. Historians still argue about what Otto's funeral meant. To some, it was a sentimental farewell to monarchy. To others, it proved that history in Vienna never really dies. It just puts on a black coat and walks slowly behind a hearse. As the final prayers end, the organ music fades into stillness. Above ground, Vienna continues as always. Trams rumble, tourists chatter, coffee cups clink. But in that crypt beneath the city, the Habsburgs sleep in perfect order. Rows of sarcophagi carved with crowns, swords, and Latin inscriptions that once promised eternity. You step quietly through the crypt, reading the names etched into bronze: Charles, Maria Theresa, Joseph, Leopold, Franz, Elizabeth. The metal is cold under your fingertips, and somewhere among them lies the heart of Emperor Franz Joseph, buried separately, as tradition demanded, still whispering through centuries of iron and marble. When you leave the crypt, the sun is setting over Vienna. The light spills golden across the rooftops, touching the cathedral spire, the opera house, the cafe terraces. Everything they built remains, but it no longer belongs to them. And perhaps that's the gentlest end of all, not collapse, but absorption. The Habsburgs have dissolved into the bloodstream of Europe, not rulers anymore, but ancestors of a continent still learning how to balance beauty and burden. As you walk away, the bells begin to toll again. Their sound is deep, steady, and familiar, the same rhythm that once called 1,000 cities to prayer. For a moment, you could swear the whole city is breathing with the same quiet, tired pride. You pause, look back once more at Schönbrun's glowing windows and think, maybe history doesn't end. It just grows quieter. Night settles again over Vienna, wrapping the city in a soft golden haze. The tourists have gone, the palace lights dim, and the hum of modern life fades into the kind of stillness that only very old cities know. You walk alone through the quiet gardens of Schönbrunn, where the gravel crunches gently beneath your feet. The scent of cut grass lingers in the air, mingling with the faint perfume of roses that have been replanted from the same gardens tended by Maria Theresa centuries ago. You pause beside the Neptune fountain, its marble figures glinting faintly in the moonlight. The water is still now. No ripples, no reflection of carriages or courtiers, only the silver ghost of time. The Habsburgs once stood here too, perhaps in this very spot, believing the world beneath them could never change. But change is what history always does best. In the moonlit quiet, you begin to think of the dynasty not as rulers, but as human beings trapped by their own myth. Imagine what it must have been like to be born knowing your blood is a job description, your smile, a political strategy. The women married off like chess pieces. The men, weighed down by crowns that grew heavier each century. Historians still debate whether the Habsburgs believed in their own sanctity. Some letters suggest they did, writing of God's will and divine lineage. Others hint at doubt. There's a fragment from Emperor Joseph II, scribbled in the margin of a sermon. Perhaps heaven tires of our excuses. You can almost hear the wry exhaustion in that line. Centuries of entitlement condensed into a single shrug. And yet, there's something strangely endearing about their persistence. The Habsburgs weren't gods, just mortals trying to make sense of an impossible legacy. They fought wars they didn't want, married people they didn't love, and bore children who carried the same burden forward. A family trying to be a nation trying to be eternal. You wander deeper into the garden, past hedges trimmed into geometric perfection. Even now, long after the gardeners and guards are gone, the precision remains. It's the Habsburg way, order as defiance against chaos. You can imagine Franz Joseph approving even now, somewhere among the statues checking his pocket watch. In the stillness, the story starts to feel circular. The dynasty began with marriages, quiet alliances meant to prevent bloodshed. Let others wage war, they said. You, happy Austria, marry. And in the end, they fell not through violence, but exhaustion. Their empire dissolved peacefully like sugar in tea, but their ghost never left. You see them everywhere if you know where to look. In Prague's Baroque domes, in Budapest's parliament, in the railway stations of Trieste and Krakow. The architecture itself is a kind of afterlife, a continent built in their image, and their bloodlines. They still exist, scattered across Europe. The descendants live ordinary lives now, engineers, artists, even farmers. Occasionally, a newspaper prints a photo of one attending a royal wedding or charity gala, and for a moment the headlines whisper, "A Habsburg still among us, one of them." Karl von Habsburg, Otto's son, works quietly for cultural preservation, helping rebuild heritage sites destroyed by war. He once said in an interview, "Our family has learned the price of history. Now we try to pay it forward." There's a kind of poetic symmetry in that, the descendants of conquerors becoming protectors of memory. You smile at the thought. The line that began with knights and crusades now curates art and archives. Evolution at last. Historians still argue what legacy the Habsburgs left behind. Was it unity or domination, peace or oppression? But standing here, surrounded by moonlight and marble, those arguments seem small. What remains is not ideology but texture, the fabric of Europe itself, stitched together by centuries of ambition and accident. You sit on a bench by the fountain. The night air feels cool against your skin. Somewhere in the city, a violin plays. Not a concert, just a lone musician practicing, the notes floating through the dark like the sigh of an old friend. You think about Charles II and his twisted jaw, about Maria Theresa riding by candlelight, about Franz Joseph rising before dawn to hold together a crumbling world. You think about Marie Antoinette stepping toward the guillotine and apologizing for the accidental touch of her foot. You think about Otto shaking hands in Brussels, turning empire into diplomacy, and you realize the Habsburgs didn't simply rule history, they carried it. Like an heirloom too valuable to sell, too cursed to keep, the clock on Schönbrunns facade strikes midnight. 12 clear notes roll through the night air, echoing off the statues and fountains. Each one feels like a heartbeat from another century. You take a deep breath, and for a moment, you swear the air smells faintly of beeswax and parchment, the scent of every Habsburg room ever sealed. The city sleeps. The empire dreams, and you, sitting there beneath the pale glow of the moon, realize that some dynasties never truly end. They just fade until they're part of the landscape, the melody you hum without knowing who wrote it. The sound of the last bell fades, leaving the gardens steeped in silver silence. The empire has vanished, but its memory lingers in every leaf, every stone, every breath of Vienna's cool air. You rise from the bench and start walking again, following the faint glow of lanterns along the gravel path. It feels less like a stroll and more like walking through the afterlife of a civilization. You pass the Gloriette, that great triumphal arch atop the hill, a symbol of victory built for wars already forgotten. From up here, the city stretches below like a tapestry, the Danube glinting, the domes of cathedrals catching moonlight, the faint hum of trams tracing invisible lines across the dark. It's hard not to imagine what the Habsburgs must have felt standing here centuries ago, rulers of a world that seemed endless. But from this height, you also see the fragility. The empires, the nations, the lines on maps, all look temporary. You understand, perhaps better than they did, how even marble erodes, how grandeur fades into nostalgia. For a moment, you close your eyes and try to picture the family at its height. The sound of carriages rolling up the palace steps, the glitter of chandeliers, the murmured Latin prayers before banquets. You imagine Maria Theresa's laughter echoing through these same corridors, the clink of Joseph II's pen scratching laws into being, the rustle of Cece's silk dress brushing across marble floors. It's beautiful, yes, but also suffocating. You realize that for all their luxury, the Habsburgs lived in cages made of ceremony. Every meal was timed, every gesture rehearsed, every marriage a transaction. The dynasty's greatness was both its triumph and its trap. Historians still argue about whether their world truly ended in 1918 or whether it simply changed its costume. Some say the European Union is their reincarnation, a new empire built not by swords but by treaties. Others insist that what the Habsburgs embodied, hierarchy, faith, formality, can never return. But standing here, you sense that their spirit didn't vanish. It just evolved. You walk slowly down the slope, through rows of trees that have seen more centuries than most nations. The leaves rustle softly, as if whispering names. Charles, Ferdinand, Maria, Franz, Otto. Generations speaking through wind. You pause at one old tree whose trunk twists in strange interwoven patterns. It looks almost human, almost royal, a living metaphor for the Habsburg line itself. Beautiful, resilient, and a little distorted by time. As you walk, you start to think of the dynasty less as people and more as story. 1,000 years of triumphs and tragedies, written in ink, sealed with wax, sung in waltzes. You can feel how the story outgrew its tellers. Maybe that's why it still fascinates. Because it's not really about power at all, but about endurance. The family that refused to stop existing, no matter how many times the world told them to fade. You reach the palace again, its great facade quiet and golden under the moon. The windows glow faintly from the inside, museum lights left on, or perhaps something older. You could almost swear you see movement in the upper halls, the faint outline of figures in old-fashioned dress, gliding through the corridors as though time forgot to close the door on them. You imagine what they would think of the world now. Cars instead of carriages, presidents instead of emperors, tourists walking through their bedrooms with audio guides. Perhaps they'd be horrified, or perhaps they'd be amused. Even without a crown, you can almost hear Maria Theresa say, "People still pay to see one." There's comfort in that thought, the idea that history has a sense of humor. You step inside one of the open archways. The air changes immediately, cooler, stiller, thick with age. The marble floors gleam faintly under dim light, and your footsteps echo just enough to sound like someone walking beside you. The scent of beeswax and old wood returns stronger now, mingling with a faint trace of perfume, maybe lavender, maybe memory. You pass a line of portraits, each face familiar yet subtly different. The same eyes, the same lips, the same unmistakable chin. The Habsburg Jaw, still watching, still present. You stop before the portrait of Franz Joseph, painted late in life. His expression is weary but composed, his uniform immaculate. For a moment you wonder if he can see you too, a stranger centuries removed, still fascinated by the shadow he left behind. Was it worth it? You whisper under your breath. He doesn't answer, of course. But in the stillness, it almost feels like he sighs. You walk on, past the grand staircase, through the hall of mirrors, and out into the courtyard again. The sky is deep blue now, and the moon hangs low. The air feels heavy with finality, as if the story is nearly told. Historians still argue about the Habsburgs' meaning. Were they the guardians of civilization, or its gilded cage? But perhaps that question misses the point. Maybe they were simply the embodiment of humanity's most enduring contradiction, the desire to preserve what time insists on changing. You take one last look at Schönbrunn, vast, luminous, eternal in appearance if not in fact. Then you whisper, almost without meaning to, "Good night." The word carries softly through the air, as if someone on the other side of history might be listening. And as you turn to leave, a light breeze stirs the curtains in an upstairs window. It looks for just a moment like a hand waving farewell. The breeze fades and the city exhales. You walk down the cobbled avenue toward the gates of Schönbrunn, your footsteps steady, the air cool and fragrant with night-blooming jasmine. Behind you, the palace glows softly, each window like an ember of memory. You realize that this is not just where the Habsburg story ends, it's where it finally rests. The world beyond the gates hums with life. Cars glide along streets that once heard the creak of royal carriages. Laughter spills from cafes where courtiers once whispered gossip over crystal glasses. The empire has turned into a rhythm of commerce, of conversation, of daily life. You feel it all around you, alive and ordinary. It strikes you how strange it is that a family who spent centuries trying to control history has become one of its most beloved subjects. Their portraits now hang not in palaces of power, but in classrooms and galleries. Their laws have turned into lessons. Their rituals, once sacred, are now performances for tourists. And yet somehow their story still matters. You stop at the main gates and glance back one last time. The night sky has clouded over, but one faint star glimmers above the palace roof. A solitary light, flickering but unyielding. It feels right. For all their flaws, their decadence, their stubbornness, the Habsburgs endured. They were both the best and worst of what humanity can be. Devoted, fearful, magnificent, fragile. Historians still argue whether their survival was genius or inertia, whether they lasted because of strategy or simply because they refused not to. But as you stand there in the hush of midnight Vienna, the answer feels simpler. They lasted because they believed in something, even when belief itself became unfashionable. You imagine the voices of the dynasty fading into the night, the formal Latin of Charles III, the commanding tone of Maria Theresa, the soft exhaustion of Franz Joseph, the quiet modern civility of Otto, all of them merging into one final whisper. We were here. You take a deep breath. The wind shifts, carrying faint echoes of church bells from St. Stephen's Cathedral. 12 strokes, another day's end. Somewhere a train horn sounds in the distance, the same rails that once connected an empire now carrying ordinary passengers home. You realize that's what the Habsburgs left behind. Connection. Not in conquest, but in culture. In the bridges and buildings, in the shared language of art, music, and ritual. They bound Europe not just by law, but by rhythm. The same rhythm that still beats under Vienna's streets tonight. You walk away from Schönbrun's gates, your shadow long across the pavement. The street lamps stretch in perfect symmetry, glowing like sentinels. The silence around you isn't empty. It's full, alive with centuries of memory. And in that moment, you understand. History doesn't vanish when empires fall. It seeps into the soil, the stone, the air. The Habsburgs may have lost their crowns, but they never lost their echo. You pause at the end of the road, turning once more toward the palace. The breeze stirs again, faint but sure, carrying the soft smell of roses from the garden. The same roses Maria Theresa once admired, the same kind her descendants planted after every war. The scent feels eternal, like the family itself, fading, returning, blooming again. The story is over, but it doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like rest, like the empire, at long last, has closed its eyes. And as you stand there, letting the night settle around you, you can almost hear a voice, calm, weary, amused, whispering through the dark. History never ends. It only changes its narrator. Now the night softens. The palace fades into a gentle blur, its lights melting into the quiet blue of the Viennese sky. The world grows slower, calmer. The air feels heavier in that comforting way that tells you it's time to rest. You take one last breath of the cool night and let your shoulders ease. The sounds of the city drift away, the trams, the murmurs, the echo of your own footsteps, until there's nothing but a steady hush. The kind of silence that feels safe. You think of the people whose lives you've walked through tonight. Emperors, queens, lovers, children, soldiers. Their triumphs and mistakes have all dissolved into the same stillness you feel now. History, for all its noise, always ends here, in quiet. So let the centuries settle. Let the marble fade, the crowns dim, the voices turn to whispers. The Habsburgs are gone, but their story, like all stories, drifts gently onward, softer, slower, lighter than it ever was before. You close your eyes. The last thing you see is the glow of Schönbrun's windows, flickering like candles in a faraway room. The air carries the faint echo of a waltz, slow, tender, and endlessly looping. And somewhere just beyond the edge of dream, the empire finally sighs and sleeps.